Chapter 41. Hero spent much of the morning in the offices of the Times talking to John Walker, the editor, who was publishing her series of articles on London's working poor. She handed him her latest piece on the city's brickmakers, and then she asked him, with studied casualness, if he'd ever heard of a convent in Portugal called Santa Iria. He stared back at her, his face unusually grim, his eyes blinking several times before he said, "I have, yes. Why do you ask?" "I want to know what happened there in 1810. He pushed up from his desk chair and went to stand at the somewhat grimy window overlooking the fog-choked street, the fingers of one hand worrying his watch chain. "It's not pretty," he warned her. "Tell me." And so he did. She arrived back at Brook Street to see Devlin standing outside at the edge of the rear terrace. He had his back to the house, his gaze on the fog-shrouded, winter-brown garden that stretched down to the mews. He still wore his caped driving coat, and she suspected he'd only just walked up from the stables. But there was a brittle tautness to the tilt of his head that reminded her in some indefinable way of the nights she'd awakened, in the hours before dawn, to find him bedevilled by dreams of a time and place he could not forget. He turned when she let herself out of the house and walked up to him, her arms wrapped across her chest for warmth. She could see the strain of too many sleepless nights in the hollowness of his cheeks, and the dark, bruise-like quality of the flesh around his strange yellow eyes. She said, "You've been talking to Alexis Sauvage again." A breath of amusement flickered across his features. "How did you know?" She shook her head. "I wish to God that woman had never come back into your life." He stared out at the thick, killing fog. "It's not her. She's simply a reminder." "I found out today what happened at Santa Iria. You went there, didn't you?" She kept her gaze on his hard profile. "After you escaped from the French camp, you went there, and you saw what the French had done." He nodded, his jaws set hard, his gaze still fixed on the rain-trodden garden below. "I suppose I knew in my heart that I was too late, but I kept hoping I might somehow be in time to warn them, to stop." She tried to say something, anything, only to find that she could not. After a moment he continued, "I was too late, of course. Major Rousseau and his men had already attacked the convent." He wrapped his hands around the stone balustrade before him, the wind flapping the shoulder capes of his driving coat. Hera found she couldn't look at his face. Santa Iria wasn't just a convent, it was also an orphanage. The French killed everything that moved, then set fire to the buildings. There was nothing left alive. Not a goat, not a dog, not a babe in its cradle. Nothing. From the distance came the crack of a whip, the thunder of hooves from an unseen carriage driven up the street fast. "And Antonio Alvarez Cabral's daughter?" asked Hero. "The abbess?" Rousseau tried to make her talk, except the poor woman knew nothing. He swallowed. You could imagine what they did to her. Hero suspected she probably could not imagine, did not want to imagine. The editor at the Times had been blessedly vague about the details. She said, "Your dreams, and that's what you see. Not always, but often. Sometimes I see them, not as I found them, but as they would have been before." She said, "It wasn't your fault." "Yes, it was. I'm the one who carried those false dispatches into French hands. My ignorance in no way excuses either my gullibility or my culpability. I knew what sort of man Oliphant was." "But how could anyone have known what he intended? He deliberately sent the French against that convent, hoping that their brutality would drive Alvarez Cabral into the arms of the British." She hesitated. "Did it work?" Devlin shook his head. No. When the old man saw what the French had done to his daughter, to the children, to the other nuns, he collapsed and died. Hero felt a deep and powerful rage building within her. And Oliphant, what happened to him? I rode straight from the blood-soaked ruins of the convent to our camp. I was going to kill him. I knew I'd hang for it, but I didn't care. Devlin huffed a soft sound devoid of any trace of humour. He'd been recalled to headquarters. His older brother had died, and he's now Lord Oliphant. Last I heard, he's been appointed governor of Jamaica. I've never seen him again. And then you sold out? Yes. Although it wasn't only because of Oliphant and Santa Iria. That was simply the culmination of so much that had gone before. We like to think we're more civilized, more honorable, more righteous than our enemies, but we're not. Just ask the dead women and children of Copenhagen, of Badajoz, of Dublin, of 1,000 forgotten hamlets and farms, and once you realize that, it does rather beg the question. Why am I fighting? Why am I killing? She rested her hand on his arm, felt the fine tremors going through him. She thought of the memories he carried with him always, the sights and smells and sounds and the suffocating weight of guilt. "It wasn't your fault," she said again. "The deaths of those women and children are on Oliphant's head, on Oliphant, and the French Major Rousseau, and the English and French officials who put two such men in positions of power." But he only pressed his lips into a tight, strange smile, and gave a faint shake of his head. She said, "What happened to Rousseau?" "He's dead," said Devlin, and she knew without being told that somehow, before Devlin left the peninsula, he'd tracked down the French major and killed him. Good. She touched her hand to his cheek, and he turned toward her, his arms coming around to draw her close, his cheek pressed to the side of her hair. She felt his chest lift against hers as he drew in a ragged breath and held her tight. And then he said the words she'd long thought she'd never hear. "God, how I love you, Hero. So much. So much." Chapter 42. Paul Gibson spent the afternoon explaining the functions and structure of the human kidney to a full theatre at St. Thomas's Hospital. Normally, he would good-naturedly rap the knuckles of any dozing audience members with a boiled fibula, and patiently field questions that showed a decided lack of attention on the part of confused students. But not today. Today, every sleepy student, every ridiculous question filled him with an unholy rage. It took a while, but he finally admitted to himself the origins of his uncharacteristic irritation. He wanted to get back to Tower Hill, to Alexei. "Sure then, but you're 6 kinds of a bloody fool," he told himself in disgust. "What are you thinking? That a fine young woman such as her might be interested in you? That she might see you as a man, a real man, with all of a man's needs and desires and dreams?" Laughing at himself, he determinedly refocused his attention on the task at hand, and resolved to think no more about her. Then he let his audience go half an hour early. He hurried back across London Bridge to the city, the crutch he used when he had to cover great distances swinging with a rhythmic tap-tap. The fog was so thick it could strangle a man if he made the mistake of breathing too deeply, and Gibson could feel the beads of moisture-encrusted grit reddening his eyes, until between the fog and his own watering vision he was nearly blind. And still he hurried on. He'd just passed the monument when he knew again that he was being followed. He whirled around, stumbling awkwardly as he almost lost his balance. "Who is it?" he called, his voice echoing hollowly back at him from out of the impenetrable murky gloom. "Why are you following me?" For a long, dreadful moment he heard only the drip of moisture and the splash of a wherryman's oars out on the river. But he knew this time that it wasn't his imagination. Someone was following him. Someone had been following him off and on for days. And rather than feel foolish for believing it, he suddenly felt foolish for ever having doubted it, for doubting himself, for having kept his fears and suspicions quiet, for not having hailed a bloody hackney when he left the hospital. "What do you want from me?" he cried, his hand tightening around the cross-brace of his crutch. The shape of a man materialized out of the fog. Massive shoulders, broad barrel chest, long, heavily muscled arms. At first, the features were indistinct. Then Gibson saw the overly long, curly black hair, and knew he was looking at Samson Bullock. "What do you want?" asked Gibson again. Bullock drew up, an insolent smile slitting his beard-stubbled face. "What makes you think I want anything with you?" "I know who you are. You're Bullock." The smile broadened. "Told you about me, did she? Did she tell you about how she killed me baby brother?" "She told me he beat his wife so badly she died." The smile was gone. "Never did. The bloody bitch fell down the stairs." "Don't you mean he kicked her down the stairs?" As soon as the words were said, Gibson wondered what kind of crazy, foolhardy courage had moved him to utter them. Once he'd been a scrappy fellow, more than able to hold his own in a brawl, and not above fighting a bit dirty when the occasion warranted it. But those days were far behind him, whereas Samson Bullock looked like the kind of man who could wring the neck of an ox with his bare hands. Gibson watched the big tradesman's upper lip curl, his nose wrinkling as he gritted his teeth together as if in a snarl. Then a strange light of amusement flooded into his face, and he laughed. "She's staying with you again, ain't she? Like you can protect her." The tradesman's small black eyes swept him scornfully. "A one-legged Irish surgeon? Think you're up to it, do you?" One of his big hands swept out to close around Gibson's neck, the fingers digging deep into flesh and sinew. Still smiling, Bullock swung Gibson up and around to slam his back against the brick wall of the shop beside them. He was dimly aware of his crutch falling to the pavement with a clatter. All his being was focused on the vice-like grip, squeezing his throat, choking off his air. "What's the matter, Irishman? Can't breathe?" Gibson clawed frantically at the massive hand clamped around his throat. He heard a roaring in his ears. His vision dimmed, took on a strange blood-red hue. He felt, rather than saw, Bullock thrust his face so close that his rough beard scraped Gibson's cheek, and a foul odour of rotten teeth washed over him. "You tell her. Tell that bitch for me. Tell her I'm gonna get her when I'm good and ready. But I'm gonna make her pay a bit more first." Still smiling, Bullock moved his outstretched arm back and forth, grinding the back of Gibson's head against the rough brick wall behind him. Then he took a step back and let Gibson go. Gibson lost his balance, falling to his good knee, his peg leg sprawled out to one side as he struggled to keep from collapsing. He cradled his burning throat in his hands, sought to draw air deep into his lungs. He smelled his own fear in the sweat that slicked his body, felt the fog damp against his face. When he looked up, the man was gone. Gibson was bent over a basin trying to pour water over the back of his head when Alexei came to take the pitcher out of his hand. "Here, let me do that for you." She took the cloth from his other hand and worked to gently clean the blood and bits of grit left by the bricks. "What happened to you?" "Samson Bullock evidently believes that the best way to ensure that his messages are delivered is to grind the messenger's head into the nearest wall." Her hands stilled at their task. "Bullock did this?" "That's nothing." "What did he say?" Gibson straightened slowly. He was painfully conscious of having stripped off his coat, so that he stood before her in shirt-sleeves and waistcoat. "What did he say?" she asked again when he didn't answer. He reached for a towel to dry his face and the back of his neck. Water dripped from his hair to run down his cheek, and he swiped at it. She said, "I take it he threatened me?" She set aside the cloth she still held and turned toward the door. "I think I'll go tell Mr. Sampson Bullock that if in the future he has anything to say to me, he needs to learn to say it to my face." "No." He snagged her arm, hauling her back around to look at him. Her color was high, her fine brown eyes snapping with anger. He said, "What happened today wasn't about threatening you. It was about demeaning me, about making me feel his power and emphasizing my own weakness. If you go to see him now, you'll be helping him to shame me. It'd be like saying I can't even take care of myself, let alone you." She drew in a quick breath that parted her lips and jerked her chest. "You saved my life. I never meant to bring you danger, but that's what I've done." He gave her what he hoped came off as a cocky smile. "I'm not as helpless as you and Sampson Bullock seem inclined to believe." "I know you're not helpless." Their gazes met, held. She was still so close to him. And somewhere along the line, without him quite noticing it, the conversation had subtly shifted. Perhaps not so much in words, but in focus. He realized he was still holding the towel and awkwardly set it aside, suddenly at a loss for what to do with his hands. He was painfully attuned to the subtle charge of raw awareness in the room, conscious of each breath he drew, of the rhythm of his blood pumping through every part of his being, of her nearness. He watched her pulse beat at the base of her slim white throat, and the moment was so powerful he found himself wishing it could stretch out and last forever. And then, just when he feared it would, she reached to cup her palm against his cheek. Tipping her head, she brushed her mouth against his, and he felt himself tremble. He told himself not to be a fool, that it was a kiss of gratitude, that she couldn't be thinking of him as a man. Not the kind of man a woman kissed with passion and took into her own body. Then he saw the saucy smile that lifted her lips, and he forgot to breathe. She took his hand and led him into the room she had made her own. A single candle had been lit against the drab gloom, casting a warm golden glow over the bed's simple counterpane. He started to say something, but she pressed 2 fingers to his lips. "Shh," she said. She let go of his hand and took a step back, her gaze locked with his. He watched her arms come up, her fingers working as she loosened the ties of her gown. She let it fall into a puddle on the floor at her feet. Her petticoat followed. She untied her shift, and with exquisite care clenched her hands in the fine linen. Then she swept her arms up and over her head, stripping it away. She stood before him, naked, except for her stockings and garters. She was so finely made, her skin so fair and soft, with a faint sprinkling of cinnamon across the mounds of her small, high breasts. Her limbs were long and impossibly slender, her waist and hips narrow, the juncture of her legs a fiery triangle. "I love you," he said. "No, you don't. You don't know me." "I know you." She shook her head, but she was still smiling. Reaching out, he fisted his hand in the heavy fall of her hair, drawing her to him. She pressed her naked body hard against the length of him, her mouth opening beneath his as the kiss became a savage, breathless onslaught that went on and on. She tore at his clothes, working to rid him of his waistcoat, his shirt. He felt her fingertips skim his naked back, and the sensation was so raw that he cried out. Then she moved to the buttons of his flap, her hands brushing the exquisitely sensitive flesh of his groin, and he almost lost control. He said, "I don't know if I can do this. It's been so long." She laughed and pushed him down on his back, his wounded head cradled by her soft pillow, her flesh glowing golden in the candlelight as she straddled him. "Then let me do it." She bent her head to kiss him again and touched him tenderly. And when the time was right, she put him inside her. He felt her envelop him with her warmth and her love, and he surrendered himself to her, to his passion, and her gift of herself. Only it came to him, as her head fell back, her mouth open and her eyes closed, as the rhythmic contractions of her inner body pulled him over into the abyss with her, that what she had really given him was the gift of himself. Afterward, when they lay cradled in each other's arms, they spoke of many things, of his childhood in Ireland, of her days with the Grand Army in Spain, of her frustration as a physician unable to practice the full range of medicine in England. "You could go back to Italy," he said, even though the very suggestion tore at his gut and tightened his throat so that he felt as if he was strangling again. "Or Germany. They have a long tradition of female physicians in Germany, too, don't they?" "They do, yes." She was silent for a moment. She lay on her side, her elbow bent, her head propped up on one fist as she traced a delicate pattern across his bare chest with her free hand. After a moment she said, "There's something I haven't told you. Something I believe may help explain what happened to my brother." He had been lying lost in a pleasant, half-dreamy state of warmth and quiet contentment. Now he found himself instantly alert. He listened as she told him. Then he said, "You need to take this to Devlin." She pushed up on both hands so that she could stare down at him. "Are you mad? Lord Jarvis is his wife's father." "He is, yes, but Devlin is not Jarvis's ally. Far from it, in fact. If anyone can find your brother's killer, it's Devlin. He'll not be letting Jarvis's involvement turn him from his purpose, and he'll not be betraying you to his lordship either, if that's what you're thinking." Her gaze met his. "I don't trust him." He caught up the heavy lock of hair that had tumbled forward to half-hide her face. "One of these days you're going to be needing to tell me what happened between the two of you in Portugal. But not now. This isn't about the past. It's about the men and women who are dying here, in London, today. First your brother, then Carmela, now Fouché. If you know anything that can stop it, you must tell Devlin." "You trust him?" "With my life." Her lips parted, trembled with uncertainty and proud stubbornness, and an onslaught of memories he could only guess at. Then she nodded, and he found himself both humbled and inspired in a way he could not have defined. Chapter 43. That evening, Sebastian was in the library, reading Augustin Baruel's work on the Revolution, when he heard a peal at the front door. Lifting his head, he listened to a woman's soft French voice. A moment later, Moray appeared in the doorway. "Madame Sauvage to see you, my lord. She says it is in regards to the murder of her brother, Monsieur Damien Pelletan." The major-domo's expression remained remarkably bland, but then he had been in Sebastian's employ for more than 2 years. Like Tom and Calhoun, he wasn't easily overset. "Sure in," said Sebastian, and set aside his book. He came from behind his desk as Alexis Sauvage entered the room. She drew up just inside the doorway, one hand knotted in the strap of her reticule, the other holding close the worn plaid shawl she had wrapped around her shoulders. "Please, have a seat," he said, indicating the chairs before the fire. She shook her head. "What I have to say will not take long. I am only here because of Paul." "Paul?" His reaction to her use of Gibson's given name must have shown on his face, because her chin came up. "He says that I should trust you, that I have been wrong to keep back information that might help you to make sense of what happened to Damien. That Jarvis is your enemy too." She paused, then added, "I hope he is right." Sebastian was aware of Hero coming down the stairs toward them, but all he said was, "What information?" "The day before he was killed, Damien told me he had overheard a conversation between Vondroy and Charles, Lord Jarvis. He couldn't catch everything that was said, but it was enough to convince him that Vondroy is engaged in a double game. That rather than representing France's interests, he's deliberately playing into Jarvis's aims, which are basically to see that these peace overtures go nowhere." It fit only too well with what Lady Peter had told him. Yet Sebastian found it difficult to accept anything this woman said at face value. He said, "It's my understanding that both André Fouché and Camille Bondurant were included in the delegation specifically to prevent that sort of connivance." "Yes, and now Fouché is dead too." Sebastian leaned back against his desk, his arms coming up to cross at his chest. "You're suggesting Fouché might also have discovered Vondroy's activities, or that Damien might have told him?" "I don't know, but it seems reasonable, does it not?" "And the attack on Golden Square?" "Was presumably meant to kill me, on the assumption that Damien must also have told me what he knew." "And how does any of this explain the macabre mutilation of the bodies? Belleton's heart and Fouché's eyes?" "That I do not know." Sebastian walked over to pour 2 glasses of Burgundy. He held one out to her, and after a moment she took it. He said, "Vondroy may well be playing a double game. He would hardly be the first to do so. But I find it difficult to believe him ghoulish enough to desecrate the bodies of his colleagues." "To what purpose?" "I'm not suggesting Vondroy is the killer." Sebastian studied her fine-boned, tightly held face, and he understood why she had withheld such a vital piece of information from him for so long. "I see. Not Vondroy, but Jarvis. That's why you didn't tell me before, because you think Jarvis is the killer, and you feared I would betray you to him because he happens to be my father-in-law? Or is it because you suspected me of being in collusion with him?" When she remained silent, he said, "I'd be the last person to deny that Jarvis is both ruthless and brutal. He would unblinkingly murder 10,000 men if he thought it would save England. Or at least England as he thinks it should be. But I can't imagine him cutting out the hearts and gouging out the eyes of his victims for amusement." "I believe that was intended to throw suspicion on someone else." "Such as?" "I don't know." "Not exactly an effective tactic, then." His words brought a flush of angry colour to her cheeks. "I didn't expect you to listen to me." She set aside her wine untasted, but rather than leave, she said, "Have you given more thought to attempting to turn your child in its mother's womb?" The question took him by surprise. "I told Lady Devlin of your offer." "And?" Sebastian looked beyond her, to where Hero now stood in the doorway. Hero said, "You accuse my father of murdering your brother. then offer to help save my child? Why? Alexis Sauvage pivoted to face her. Physically, the two women couldn't have been more dissimilar. Where the Frenchwoman was small and almost unnaturally thin, Hero stood tall and strong. Yet both possessed a comfortable sense of self, combined with a rare willingness to buck the conventions and expectations of their day. Alexis Sauvage said, "I am a physician. That is what I do. Yet you'll understand, surely, if I distrust your motives." Something wafted across the Frenchwoman's face. "If you are unwilling to allow me to attempt to train the child, there are certain positions which sometimes achieve the same objective. You must kneel with your arms folded on the floor or mattress before you, and your head resting on your hands. Do this for 15 or 20 minutes every 2 hours. It might be enough to nudge the child into turning itself." When Hero remained silent, Alexis Sauvage said, "Try it, please. But if the child still refuses to turn, do not wait too long. I promise. I mean you no harm." She glanced over at Sebastian. "Good evening, monsieur." And she swept from the room. They listened to her light step descending the front steps. Hero's gaze met his. "Do you trust her?" "No," he said, and took a long swallow of his wine. Hero went to the window to watch the Frenchwoman climb into a waiting hackney. After a moment she said, "Do you think she's right? That Jarvis is behind this?" "Honestly, I don't know." She turned to look at him. "I think you need to talk to Hendon." He knew she was right. Not only was Hendon directly involved in the preliminary peace discussions, but no one knew better than Hendon what Jarvis was capable of. That didn't make what Sebastian was about to do any easier. Once, Alistair St. Cyr, the 5th Earl of Hendon, had been the proud father of 1 daughter and 3 strong sons. The 2 older boys were his favourites, a reality the youngest child, Sebastian, accepted, even as it grieved him more than he ever let anyone know. Over the years he had sought endless explanations for his father's harshness, for the undisguised mingling of anger and bemusement that so often pinched the Earl's features when his gaze fell on his youngest and least satisfactory son. Was it because Sebastian was so unlike the Earl, in temperament and interests as well as in appearance? Or was it for some other reason entirely? Sebastian could never decide. And then, one by one, Hendon's sons died. First the eldest, Richard, and then his middle son, Cecil, leaving only the youngest, Sebastian, as the Earl's heir. It wasn't until Sebastian was a man grown that he'd learned the truth, that Hendon's beautiful, laughing, golden-haired countess had played her husband false, that Sebastian was not, in fact, the Earl's own son, but a bastard, sired by one of the Countess's nameless, faceless lovers, as Hendon had always known. Always. The Earl was dozing in a chair beside the library fire in his massive Grosvenor Square townhouse when Sebastian came to pause in the doorway. Hendon was in his late 60s now, his body stocky and slightly stooped with age, his heavily jowled face lined and sagging, his hair almost white and beginning to thin. Sebastian paused in the doorway, his gaze on the man he'd thought of as his father for 29 years, the man the world still believed to be his father. Sebastian supposed that in time he would be able to forgive Hendon for all the lies of his growing-up years, but he wasn't sure he could ever forgive the Earl for allowing those lies to drive Sebastian from the woman he'd once loved with all his heart and soul. The fact that Sebastian had found a new love in no way diminished either his anger or the hurt that fueled it. Yet, as his gaze travelled over the old man's familiar, once well-loved features, he felt an upswelling of powerful, unwanted emotions that he quickly suppressed. He closed the door behind him with a click and watched Hendon draw in his breath in a half-snore, then straighten with a jerk.
"Devlin!"
The Earl swiped one thick hand over his lower face.
"Didn't hear you come in. This is unexpected."
Since the two men had barely exchanged half a dozen painful, polite greetings for many months now, that was something of an understatement. Sebastian said, "I understand you're involved with the delegation sent by Napoleon to explore the possibility of peace negotiations between our two countries." Hendon cleared his throat.
"Heard about that, have you?"
"Yes." Hendon pushed to his feet and went to where his pipe and tobacco rested on a table near the hearth.
"I expected you might, once you started looking into the death of that French physician. What was his name?"
"Pelletan."
"That's right, Pelletan."
He fussed with his pipe, filling the bowl with tobacco and tamping it down with the pad of his thumb. Then he cast Sebastian a sideways glance.
"You know I can't discuss the progress of the negotiations with you."
"I realize that. What I'm interested in is the attitude of various individuals toward the possibility of peace. I'm told Jarvis favors continuing the war until our troops are in Paris and Napoleon is ousted from the throne."
"I'd say that about sums it up, yes."
"And Liverpool?"
Well, the Prime Minister's attitude is slightly different. He'd like to see Boney gone as much as anyone, but he's also sensitive to the economic and political costs of the war. I suspect that if France would agree to withdraw to its original borders, Liverpool could find a way to live with a Corsican upstart. After all, Napoleon is now married to the sister of the Emperor of Austria. There's something to be said for viewing their young child as a living union of the traditional with the modern, a reconciliation of sorts."
"True," said Sebastian. He knew without being told where Hendon stood on the issue. As much as Hendon hated radicalism and republicanism, he'd been growing increasingly troubled by the toll that 20 years of war was taking on Britain and her people. "In other words, you and Liverpool are receptive to the negotiations, whereas Jarvis wants them to fail."
"Who said it? I didn't."
Sebastian watched the Earl light a taper and apply it to his pipe. "In my experience, Jarvis usually achieves what he wants." Hendon looked up, his cheeks hollowing as he sucked on his pipe, their gazes meeting through the haze of blue smoke.
"Yes."
"Any chance Jarvis could be actively working to ensure that the negotiations fail?"
"By literally butchering the members of the delegation, you mean?"
Hendon sucked some more on his pipe, his eyes narrowing with thought.
"Bit ghoulish, even for Jarvis, wouldn't you say?"
"Perhaps. What about the possibility that Jarvis has suborned Vaudreuil himself?"
"To be honest, I've wondered about that. I've no proof, mind you. It's just a feeling I have."
Sebastian nodded and started to turn away. "Thank you."
"Devlin?"
He glanced back at the Earl. Hendon's teeth clamped down on the stem of his pipe.
"How does Lady Devlin?"
"She is well."
"And my grandson? When is he expected to make his appearance?"
The child would be no true grandchild to Alistair St. Cyr, but if a boy, he would some day become, in turn, Viscount Devlin, and eventually Earl of Hendon. "Soon," said Sebastian, after only a moment's hesitation. Hendon nodded, his lips relaxing into a faint smile. And Sebastian knew again the whisper of an old emotion he did not want, a sensation all tangled up with every painful and joyous memory of a childhood he had no desire to revisit.
"You'll let me know?"
Hendon asked gruffly. "Yes." And then, because there was nothing more to say, Sebastian left. The night was cold, the fog a thick, foul presence that seemed to press down on the city. Sebastian walked through empty streets, his footsteps echoing hollowly in the moisture-laden air. He was trying to sort through a tangle of evidence and explanations surrounding this baffling series of murders. But his thoughts kept returning unbidden to a lonely old man standing beside his hearth, his pipe in his hand, his startlingly blue eyes clouded with a host of contradictory emotions that Sebastian suspected the Earl himself never completely understood. He was about to turn and climb the steps to his house when he became aware of someone running behind him. He whirled, his hand going to the dagger in his boot, just as a breathless voice exclaimed, "My Lord Devlin!" One of Lovejoy's constables appeared out of the fog, his open mouth sucking air painfully, his somewhat ponderous stomach jiggling with his half-trot. Sebastian relaxed. "Yes? What is it?" The constable drew up, his full, florid face slick with sweat despite the cold, his hands on his knees as he hunched over and sought to even his breathing. "Begging your lordship's pardon, but there's been a murder. Sir Henry thought you might like to know." "What's happened?" "A gentleman's been murdered in Birdcage Walk." The constable straightened, his breath still coming in panting gasps. "Leastways, the lady, gentleman with her, him, says it's a gentleman. A gentleman dressed up like a lady it is. Never seen nothing like it in all me born days." Chapter 44. The promenade, known as Birdcage Walk, ran along the south side of St. James's Park. A broad carriageway lined with rows of elm and lime, it was open to commoners traversing it on foot. Only members of the royal family were allowed to drive down Birdcage Walk. It wasn't a privilege they exercised often, but the prerogative remained exclusively theirs nonetheless. Over the past 50 or more years, the walk had become notorious as a popular molly market or cruising ground. The area's proximity to the nearby barracks meant that handsome young guardsmen, eager to earn an extra guinea or two, could inevitably be found there. As Sebastian walked beneath the fog-shrouded branches of the winter-bared trees, he wondered if that was why Ambrose Lachapelle had come here. But as he approached the huddle of great-coated men near the eastern end of the walk, he was surprised to see the tall, chestnut-haired Serena sitting hunched on a bench off to one side. She had her head down, her hands thrust between her knees in a posture that would have made more sense if she'd been wearing breeches. Her green silk gown was torn, the black lace that had once trimmed the neckline ripped so that it dangled off one shoulder. "Ah, Lord Devlin!" called Sir Henry Lovejoy, separating himself from the knot of constables, beside what Sebastian could now see was the sprawled body of another woman, or in all probability a man in a woman's red velvet gown, topped by a short white fur cape, stained dark with blood. "I thought you might want to see this." Sebastian glanced again at Serena. The French courtier did not look up. "What happened?" Sebastian asked the magistrate. "Her name is Angelface, or at least that's what she called herself when she was wearing skirts. In breeches he was James Farragut, a jeweller who kept a shop in the Haymarket. According to the—" Sir Henry paused, as if trying to settle on an appropriate noun. "The person who was with her, him, they were simply walking along the carriageway when an unknown man came up behind them, stabbed Farragut in the back, and then ran off." "Farragut is dead?" "Oh, yes. I gather he died almost instantly." Sebastian went to hunker down beside the dead man. Of medium height and slim, he had softly curling dark hair and a delicately boned face ending in a strong jawline. Sebastian had never seen him before. "How did you know I might be interested?" "The person who was walking with the victim suggested it." Sebastian pushed to his feet and went to where Lachapelle still sat. The French courtier might have fought bravely against the forces of the Revolution, but the murder of his friend had obviously affected him profoundly. "You all right?"
"Yes."
Serena thrust out her jaw and blew a long breath up over her face.
"Oh, God, it's my fault. Angel is dead because of me."
Sebastian sat on the bench beside her.
"What were you doing here?"
A ghost of a smile touched the courtier's painted lips.
"Caterwauling, of course. There are some grand guardsmen to be found along here."
Caterwauling. Sebastian had heard they also called it picking up trade, or finding someone to endorse. He said,
"Bit chilly, isn't it?"
Serena shrugged.
"The cold tends to discourage the bastards working for the Society for the Suppression of Vice."
Sebastian stared off across the fog-shrouded park.
"Why do you say you're responsible for Angel Face's death?"
Serena kept her gaze on the sprawled body of her friend.
"She was cold. I lent her my fur cape. It's very distinctive. I'm known for it. I think whoever killed her saw it and thought she was me."
Sebastian studied the dead Haymarket jeweller. In the darkness and fog she could easily have been mistaken for the French courtier. And yet—
"You can't know that for certain," said Sebastian. "What? You think this is a coincidence?"
Sebastian shook his head.
"What can you tell me about the man who stabbed her?" "Not much, I'm afraid. It all happened too fast. At first I thought he'd simply run up behind us and pushed Angel to be rude. People do that sometimes, you know. But then she coughed and staggered against me, grabbing my dress to try and stay upright, so that I had to catch her. By the time I realized she'd been stabbed, the man who'd done it was gone."
Sebastian studied the rows of limes along the border of the carriageway. Just to the south of the park lay the recruit house, and beyond that, the gardens at the rear of the Gifford Arms Hotel. Until now, everyone killed had been either a member of the French delegation or connected to it in some way. So why the hell had La Chapelle been attacked? Aloud he said, "Who would want to kill you? Not just any random Molly, but you."
"I honestly don't know."
Sebastian brought his gaze back to the courtier's painted face.
"Did you tell the magistrates who you are? I mean, who you really are?"
Serena rolled her eyes.
"Seriously, do you truly think I would?" "There will be an inquest, remember? What would you suggest as my choice of attire for the occasion? Should I go as Serena Fox or as Ambrose Lachapelle, the gentleman who was cruising Birdcage Walk dressed as a lady? Either way, what do you imagine my reception would be?" "I wouldn't think you'd care. Do you know how many Mollies have been beaten to death by London mobs?" "No, but I would imagine it's a fair number." "It is."
Sebastian watched the mist drift between the dark trunks of the trees. He could smell the damp grass and the wet stones of the walk and the spilled blood of the murdered man. "If you're not going to tell me who you think did this, then why the bloody hell did you have the magistrates alert me to what happened?" An unexpected smile flashed across the Molly's sombre features. "It was amazing the effect your name had on the local constabulary. 1 minute they were all set to hustle me off to the nearest roundhouse. Then I chanced to utter your name, and it was like a magic talisman. I tried asking them to contact Provence, but they seemed to find it difficult to believe that the uncrowned King of France would consort with one of my kind." She paused. "You obviously consort with all kinds." Sebastian suspected chance had nothing to do with it, but he simply rose and said, "I suggest you avoid dark parks and arcades for a while, or else, if you must, carry a muff gun and keep your wits about you. If you should suddenly think of someone with an interest in doing away with you, you know where to find me." He was turning towards Sir Henry when he recalled something Lady Giselle had said to him the previous night at the Duchess of Claiborne's soirée. He paused. What can you tell me about the Dark Countess?" Serena leaned back against the bench's rails. "Good God, what has she to do with anything?" "I have no idea." "Who is she?" "No one knows, actually. That's one of the reasons why she's called the Dark Countess. She lives in a castle in Thuringia, and has never been seen in daylight, only glimpsed in the shadowy interiors of carriages. When she walks the castle's grounds, she is always veiled, and she dresses only in black. Black gown, black gloves, black veil. She has a man with her, a count, although they say he is neither her husband or nor her lover. Speculation has it that he may be a courtier. Or her keeper." "Her keeper?" Those who serve her are kept carefully guarded, but rumors have naturally circulated. They say she's in her mid-30s and is as blonde and blue-eyed as our own dear Marie-Thérèse was as a child. Oh, and she has a fondness for the fleur-de-lis." The stylized lily, or iris, had been associated with the royal family of France for 1,000 years. Sebastian's eyes narrowed. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything. Only that one can understand how certain speculation might have arisen. The journey of Marie-Thérèse from Paris to Vienna in 1795 was cloaked in secrecy, as were her years in the temple. Some believe she was raped while in prison, that she was pregnant when released by the revolutionaries and had to be hidden away. Others suggest that her experiences overturned the balance of her mind, so that after her release she was either unable or unwilling to take up the kind of prominent role required of the only surviving child of a martyred king and queen of France. The theory being that an impostor was put in her place, while the real Marie-Thérèse lives out her life in seclusion in a castle in Germany. That is the theory, yes, although anyone with any sense knows that it is pure myth." "Why is that?" Ambrose Lachapelle met his gaze. "Because anyone undertaking to arrange such a dangerous substitution would be certain to select an impostor with a strong mental fortitude and unshakable balance. Whereas the Marie-Thérèse the world has seen these past 18 years. He shrugged and shook his head, as if unwilling to put the rest of his thoughts into words. "Is she mad?" Sebastian asked quietly. The courtier thrust the splayed fingers of one hand through his hair in a typically masculine gesture. "She is damaged. No one can deny that. You've noticed her voice. They like to say it is the result of her refusal to speak to her jailers, that she found it difficult to make sounds once she finally began to speak again. Yet she also likes to boast of her proud responses to the revolutionaries' taunts and questions, and she frequently recites her rosary aloud." "So what did happen to her voice?" "I have heard that severe emotional trauma can permanently affect one's vocal cords, although there are also those who suggest she screamed so long and so loud that it damaged her voice." "Was she raped in prison?" "If she was, she would never admit it. But when one thinks of what was done to her brother—" Again that silent, suggestive lifting of the shoulders. "I've heard her say she used to sit up all night, dressed in a chair, because she was afraid to undress and go to bed. Why do that unless something had happened to make her afraid? Can you really imagine that the men who did such vile things to the boy prince would spare the princess? An attractive but despised young woman, alone and utterly in their power?" Sebastian shifted his gaze to the gravel carriageway. The men from the nearest dead house had arrived and were shifting the jeweller's body onto their shell. He watched them lift the burden between them with a grunt. A new explanation for Damien Pelleton's murder and for the attempted murder of his sister was beginning to take shape in his imagination. He said, "The man who killed your friend, what did he look like?" The courtier frowned with the effort of thought. "I didn't see him well.
He wore a greatcoat and scarf, with his hat pulled low over his forehead. All I can say with any certainty is that he was dark-haired and roughly your height, only slightly stockier."
The description matched that of the man who had attacked Sebastian at Stoke Mandeville, and again in York Street, although he had no doubt it also matched any number of other men in London. "He didn't say anything?"
"No, nothing."
"Did you notice his eyes?"
"His eyes? No. Why?"
Sebastian shook his head.
"I'll ask you one more time. Who would have reason to kill you?" But Serena simply stared off across the park, as if looking for the answer in the mists that swirled among the winter-bared trees. Chapter 45. Thursday, 28th of January. The next morning Sebastian was easing on his Hessians when Calhoun said, "You know how you asked me to look further into Samson Bullock, my lord?"
Sebastian glanced over at his valet.
"Discovered something interesting, did you?" "You were right, my lord. Bullock spent 6 years in the 9th Foot. He came back to London when his unit was reduced in 1802, after the Peace of Amiens." "In other words," said Sebastian, stomping his foot into his boot, "he knows more about gunpowder than your average cabinet-maker." "Considerably more, I should think. He was in the artillery." Samson Bullock was flooding a new tabletop with boiled linseed oil when Sebastian walked up to him. The fog was still so thick that a deep gloom filled the shop, and the cabinet-maker had lit the lantern suspended over his work. The air was heavy with the smell of warm oil and freshly shaved wood, and rank male sweat. Sebastian stood for a moment, arms crossed at his chest, and watched the cabinet-maker turn the pale raw wood a deep, rich brown as the oil soaked into the surface. Bullock glanced up at him, then dipped his cloth into the tin of oil, and went back to rubbing the piece. "What do you want from me?" he demanded after a moment. "I've got nothing to say to you." "I understand you were in the 9th Foot, the artillery, to be precise." "Aye, what of it?" "I would imagine you know a fair bit about gunpowder, don't you?" Bullock kept his gaze on his work, although Sebastian noticed his movements had become slower, more deliberate. "Suppose I do. What of it?" "You heard about the explosion in Golden Square?" "You'd be hard-pressed to find a body hereabouts who hasn't heard of it." "Did you know the charge was set directly beneath Madame Sauvage's rooms?" "Now, how would I know that?" "I thought you might have heard. After all, it's not often someone tries to blow up a London house with gunpowder." The cabinet-maker flung down his cloth with enough force to send thick golden globules of oil flying in all directions. "What are you saying? I done it. Is that what you're saying?" Sebastian subtly shifted his weight, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. "You did threaten to kill her, remember?" "Yeah? Well, she weren't killed now, was she? It was that Basque bitch what bought it." Sebastian studied the man's small black eyes. The scar across his cheek had darkened to a deep, vicious purple. A mistake? I wonder. Or a deliberate attempt to hurt Alexis Sauvage by killing someone she loved? When the cabinet-maker remained silent, Sebastian said, "She didn't kill your brother. He died of jail fever, in prison." "Who put him there?" "You mean by having the courage to stand up and say what everyone in the neighbourhood knew to be true? That your brother was a brutal wife-beater." "Why, His face twisted with raw savagery. Bullock grabbed a long, sharp awl and lunged round the table to come at Sebastian with the tool clutched in his fist like a stiletto. Sebastian yanked his own knife from the sheath in his boot, the carefully honed blade winking in the lamplight as he settled into a street fighter's crouch. The cabinet-maker drew up, his lips twitching, his fist still tight around the awl's worn wooden handle. "What's the matter?" said Sebastian. "Does the idea of a fair fight give you pause? Do you prefer stabbing men in the back and blowing up women in their homes?"
A strange, eerie smile lit up the cabinet-maker's face.
You think you're real smart, don't you? Iron mighty lord that you are, living in that big fancy house surrounded by all them other grand knobs. Think you can come in here and talk to me like you're still a captain and I'm just some swadkin? Think I've got to play by your rules?
How do you know I was a captain? The man's smile widened.
Think you're the only one can ask questions. I know all about you and your wife, and about the child she's carrying in her belly. I even know about that black cat you fancy.
Sebastian was careful to keep all traces of his instinctive reaction off his face and out of his voice. All that remained was a cold, lethal purposefulness.
You stay away from my wife. What the matter, Captain? You scared? I see you anywhere near my wife, my house, or my cat, and you're a dead man. You understand?
Bullock laughed.
You're saying you'd risk hanging for killing the likes of me? Yes.
For a moment, the man's self-satisfied smile slipped. Then it slid wide again.
I reckon maybe you mean it after all. But you got to see me coming, don't you, Captain? And I can move real quiet when I wants to. Quiet as a raindrop running down a window pane, or a dog dying somewhere alone in the night.
I have extraordinarily good hearing, said Sebastian. And then he left Bullock's workshop before he gave in to the temptation to kill the bastard then and there. It was only afterwards that Sebastian found himself wondering if he'd just made a terrible mistake. Chapter 46. Sebastian had long ago come to the conclusion that there were two types of madmen in this world. Places like Bedlam were full of those society labelled as insane, men and women who heard voices, who lurched between mania and despair, or who were so tormented by life's vicissitudes or their own demons that they simply disengaged from the world. Many were undoubtedly crazy enough to commit murder, but they seldom got away with it. More dangerous by far, in Sebastian's estimation, were those like Samson Bullock, men with a solid grasp of reality who seemed sane, yet whose thought processes were breathtakingly brutal in their single-minded self-interest. Easily enraged, and never forgiving of the most insignificant of perceived slights or injuries, they moved through life with an utter disregard for the wants and desires of those around them. But there were times when Sebastian wondered if he was wrong, if perhaps people like Bullock weren't actually mad after all. Perhaps they simply lacked a fundamental component of what we like to believe it means to be human. The problem with that theory was that Sebastian had known dogs and horses capable of the very love and compassion such individuals seemed to lack. Utterly without conscience or empathy, they saw others not as fellow beings, but as targets or opportunities. Not all were violent or lethal, but those who were could kill without guilt, convinced that their victims either brought death on themselves or were too inconsequential to merit consideration. A man like Bullock could easily have killed both Alexis Sauvage's brother and her aging, faithful servant as part of a twisted plan to avenge himself on the woman he held responsible for his own brother's death. For the same reason, Bullock was also more than capable of cutting out a man's heart. Sebastian had no evidence to suggest that Bullock knew about the relationship between the young French doctor and the woman Bullock hated, but it was certainly possible that in the process of following and watching her, Bullock had somehow learned of the connection, and yet, why would Bullock also kill and mutilate Colonel André Fouché, or try to kill Ambrose Lachapelle? That implied a connection to the Bourbons, or an interest in the peace negotiations that Bullock lacked. The connection between Lachapelle and the peace delegation was tenuous, but there. Still thoughtful, Sebastian turned his steps toward the Gifford Arms. Monsieur Armand Vondreuil was feeding the ducks beside the ornamental water in St. James's Park when Sebastian walked up to him. "There was another murder last night, just over there, on Birdcage Walk," Sebastian said. "Did you know?" The Frenchman scattered a handful of breadcrumbs, his attention seemingly all for the ducks quacking and jostling around him. "According to what I am hearing, the attack was on one of the Mollies who frequent the walk. What could it possibly have to do with me?" "I don't know. That's what I'm trying to figure out. Perhaps you see connections where none exist." "I don't think so." The Frenchman smiled faintly and scattered more breadcrumbs. Sebastian said, "I've been listening to some interesting whispers. Whispers that tell me Damien Pelletan discovered you're playing a double game, that while you pretend to serve the interests of France, you're actually cooperating with Lord Jarvis to ensure that the peace negotiations come to naught." Vondreuil puffed out his chest and lowered his heavy dark brows with an admirable display of moral outrage. "That's preposterous! Why would I do such a thing?" "Material reward is the most typical reason. That, and revenge. For some previous slight, perhaps. Then again, there's always the possibility of securing a prestigious position in the Restoration government. Although, if that is your motive, you can't be aware of Marie-Thérèse's scathing opinion of you." Vondreuil threw away the last of the breadcrumbs in a swift, angry gesture. "What are you suggesting? That I killed Damien Pelletan because he discovered I'm an English agent of influence? What about André Fouché? Am I to have done away with him for the same reason? And why, precisely, would I steal their hearts and eyes? As grisly mementos of their past faithfulness and service?" He swiped one hand through the air before him as if brushing away an annoying fly. "Bah! This is ridiculous." Sebastian studied the Frenchman's red face and thrusting jaw. He had no trouble believing Armand Vondreuil capable of killing two of his colleagues, if he thought it necessary to protect himself. But the conviction that something else, or at least something more, was going on here remained. Sebastian said, "Did Damien Pelletan ever speak to you of his father, specifically of his father's visits to the Temple prison in the summer of 1795? The Frenchman looked confused, his mouth hanging open so that he had to swallow before he answered. "What?" "His father, Dr. Philippe Jean Pelletan, visited the Temple prison at least twice in the summer of 1795. He treated the little Dauphin before his death, and he may have seen Marie-Thérèse as well. Damien Pelletan never said anything about it to you?" "No, but surely you don't think something that happened so long ago could have anything to do with the murders here in London today?" "I don't know. How much time did Pelletan spend with Colonel Fouché?" Vondreuil frowned. "Some. They would sit together of an evening, drinking brandy, talking." "Talking about what?" "Fouché's time in the army, women, their hopes for the future." He shrugged. "What do young men speak of when they drink? I never paid much attention to them." "So Pelletan might have told Fouché of his father's observations of the orphans in the Temple?" "I suppose so, yes, but what are you suggesting?" Sebastian watched the ducks waddle away across the wet grass, quacking contentedly as their bulbous bodies lurched comically from side to side. What was he suggesting? That Marie-Thérèse had been brutally raped by her jailers in the Temple prison? That she had been impregnated, or so badly injured that they'd summoned a physician to her? That the possibility of what had happened in the Temple, of what had really happened there, becoming known, had so horrified her that she dispatched her minions to kill and kill again in the hopes of keeping the truth quiet? Sebastian had no doubt she was capable of ordering the deaths of any number of men, if she thought it necessary to preserve what she saw as her divine family's honor. But was she mad enough to order her henchman to steal her first victim's heart and gouge out the eyes of the second? He wasn't sure. Vondroy said, "Are you suggesting these killings are somehow related to the death of the Dauphin? But that is madness." Sebastian met the Frenchman's gaze and held it. Cutting out a man's heart is madness. Chapter 47. Claire Bisset came to see Hero shortly before 11 that morning. The Frenchwoman was pale and wraith-like, with hazel eyes set deep in a gaunt face, and dull, dark blonde hair drawn back in a severe knot. Her old-fashioned dress was hopelessly faded and darned at the elbows, cuffs, and collar, although she'd obviously tried hard to present a clean, neat appearance. She looked as if she hadn't eaten in a fortnight. She brought with her the names of respectable people who could vouch for her integrity, honesty, and trustworthiness, although she admitted she had never held such a position as the one for which she was applying. Her only qualification was having cared for her own 2 children, both of whom were now dead. Hero took the list of names, sent for tea and sandwiches, and slowly coaxed the anxious, stiff woman to talk. They spoke not only of children, but of Voltaire and Rousseau, of the concept of limited monarchy, and the recent attempts to launch an expedition to the North Pole. After half an hour, Hero said, "I'll have Murray show you to your room in the nurseries. You can make arrangements with him to have your things brought over." The woman's eyes widened. "But you can't mean to engage me without checking my references?" "I will check them, of course. And if they tell me you're a charlatan, I shall let you go. Only I hope I'm not such a poor judge of character." Claire Bisset was surprised into a soft laugh. It was the first laugh Hero had heard from her. Then the woman cocked her head to one side and said, "The child is due when?" Hero's hand tightened round her cup, but she said calmly enough, "Soon." "There is a problem." When Hero simply stared at her, Claire Bisset hastened to say, "I beg your pardon, my lady, I should not have asked." Hero shook her head. "No. As it happens, you are right. The babe is lying breech. Ah, my first child, Henri, was stubborn in that way, but a good friend of mine turned him in the womb." "Do you mean Madame Sauvage?" "I do, yes." "And what she did worked?" "It did, yes. I knew the instant he turned. It felt just like a giant fish flopping inside me." Hero set aside her teacup. "How long have you known her?" "Madame Sauvage. We were children together in Paris." "So you knew Damien Pelletan as well?" "No. My family had moved to Nice by the time Dr. Philippe Jean brought Damien home." Hero shook her head, not understanding. "What do you mean, brought him home?" "Damien Pelletan was Alexis' half-brother. She didn't know he existed until she was nearly grown." "When was this?" Hero asked sharply, more sharply than she had intended. Claire Bisset frowned with the effort of memory. "I do not recall precisely. It was some time after the Terror. The summer of 1795, perhaps." Chapter 48. The Dowager Duchess of Claiborne was famous for never leaving her bedchamber before noon or 1 o'clock. She was still sipping her hot chocolate in bed when Sebastian walked into the chamber and tossed his hat and driving coat on a chair. "Do I take it my useless excuse for a butler has simply abandoned all attempts to exclude you?" demanded Henrietta, sitting up straighter. "Give the man credit. He tried." She put up a hand to adjust her bed cap. "What do you want now?" Sebastian went to warm himself before the fire. "I want to know what you can tell me about Lady Giselle Edmondson." "Lady Giselle? Good heavens! Whatever for?" "Humour me.
Well, let's see.
She frowned thoughtfully.
Her father was the 3rd Earl of Bandor, handsome man but sadly emotional and far too taken with the works of the French philosophe. He moved to Paris shortly after he came down from Oxford and refused to return home, even when his father died, and he inherited the title and estates. He married a Frenchwoman. He did, one of Marie Antoinette's ladies. Giselle spent much of her early childhood at Versailles. She and Marie-Thérèse were essentially raised together. And then came the Revolution. Henrietta set down her chocolate cup with a soft chink. Yes, foolish man. He could have left. So many did. But he was convinced he was witnessing something extraordinary. And so he was, only not quite what he had anticipated. He and his countess were killed. Yes, Giselle survived, of course, but no trace has ever been found of the 2 younger children. The boy, who would have been the 4th Earl, was declared dead some years ago. So who holds the title now? A cousin. Since the majority of Bandor's wealth was safe in England, I assume Giselle's portion survived the Revolution. Oh, yes. She could have married at any time, had she wished. So why didn't she? Henrietta gave him a long, solemn look. Really, Sebastian, use your imagination. You know what those days were like, the things that were done to gentlewomen. I hear there was even a child, although fortunately it died shortly after birth. I see, he said softly, and he thought it probably explained much about both Lady Giselle and Marie-Thérèse. Henrietta said, Most of those hanging around the Bourbons are a drain on their resources, but not Giselle. If anything, I suspect she actually helps to support the princess. They've been together ever since Marie-Thérèse was released from prison. What do you think of her? Henrietta pushed out an oddly heavy sigh. Well, she's charming and pretty, and certainly far more likable than Marie-Thérèse. But, prompted Sebastian, let's just say I would have been very troubled had one of my own sons wished to wed her. Meaning what? But Henrietta only shook her head, reluctant to put her implications into words. Ambrose Lachapelle was inspecting a tray of imported laces in a small shop on Bond Street when Hero descended from her carriage and bore down upon him. "Walk up the street with me a ways, monsieur," she said, smiling. "There's something I'd like to discuss with you." He cast a quick, apprehensive glance at her swollen belly, then looked away. "Can you walk?" "Of course I can walk. I promise I've no intention of delivering in the middle of Bond Street, so you needn't look so alarmed." He raised his chin and twisted it to one side, as if his neckcloth had suddenly become too tight. "Why me?" "I've just discovered something extraordinary, and in thinking it over, I've decided you're probably the most likely person to be able to explain it to me." "I don't believe I like the sound of that," said the French courtier. But Hero simply gave a tight, determined smile and bore him inexorably up the street. Chapter 49. After leaving his Aunt Henrietta's Mayfair house, Sebastian spent the next several hours in St. Catherine's, talking to the residents of Cat's Hole and Hangman's Court. He was working on a theory that was still missing too many parts to be even remotely feasible, and he was beginning to wonder if he was driven more by his own prejudices and presumptions than anything else. He finally found a half-blind, gin-soaked ex-soldier who claimed he'd seen a couple of strangers near Hangman's Court the night Peloton was killed. But his descriptions were vague, and he said the two men didn't seem to be together. The soldier also swore that if there'd been a woman there too, he'd have noticed her and remembered her. Sebastian wasn't so sure. He was standing on London Bridge, his elbows on the stone parapet,
his gaze on the cold, mist-swirled waters below, when Ambrose Lachapelle walked up to him. "You're a hard man to find," said the Frenchman. Sebastian shifted his gaze to the man beside him. "I didn't know you were looking for me." Today the courtier wore the polished Hessians, buckskin breeches, and the elegant greatcoat of a man about town. Only the soft curls peeping out from beneath the brim of his top hat reminded one of Serena Fox. Sebastian said, "Last night you told me you didn't know who might want to kill you." "Change your mind?" "Let's just say your wife changed my mind." "Lady Devlin?" Lachapelle stood with his gloved hands clasped behind his back, his gaze on the forest of masts that filled the river below the bridge. After a moment he said, "How much has Madame Sauvage told you of her brother's childhood?" "You mean on the Ile de la Cité?" "No, before that." Sebastian studied the courtier's exquisite, fine-boned face. "I didn't know there was a before that." The Frenchman nodded, as if Sebastian had only confirmed what he'd already known, or at least suspected. "Until the summer of 1795, Philippe Jean Pelletan had only one child, a girl named Alexandrie. But then, one day in early June, he returned to his house on the Ile de la Cité, bringing with him a small boy. He claimed the lad was his own son, a love child, born of a secret affair some 10 years before. He told his curious neighbours that the boy and his mother had been imprisoned during the Terror. The mother died, so Pelletan was now bringing the child home to raise as his own." "Are you saying that child was Damien?" "He was, yes. Needless to say, there were whispers. Philippe Jean had been a widower for some years. So why had no one ever heard of this boy? Not only that, but the child was quite fair, whereas the elder Pelletan had black hair and dark brown eyes." A cold gust of wind blew the mist against Sebastian's face. He smelled the river and the dankness of the bridge's ancient wet stones, and the smoke from 100,000 coal fires, burning unseen in the fog-shrouded city. "What are you suggesting? That Philippe Jean Pelletan was somehow complicit in a scheme that successfully rescued the Dauphin and substituted a dead or dying child in his place? That Damien Pelletan wasn't his son at all, but the lost Dauphin of France?" "You can't be serious." "Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying I believe it myself. But that doesn't mean the possibility has not been suggested by others." Sometimes a piece of information was like a solitary candle kindled in a dark, empty room, burning bright, but useless. Yet there were times when its light made sense of what had, until then, remained subtly inexplicable or unseen. Sebastian said, "So that's why both the Comte de Provence and Marie-Thérèse went out of their way to consult with Damien Pelletan. It had nothing to do with their health at all. They wanted to see for themselves how much he resembled the dead prince." "And what was their conclusion?" The Frenchman shrugged. "In my experience, we tend to find resemblances where we look for them, whether in truth they exist or not. After so many years, who could say with any certainty?" Sebastian thought about the body he'd seen lying on Gibson's slab, the high sloping forehead and prominent nose so much like Marie-Thérèse's, or 1,000 other people's. If Provence and Marie-Thérèse had gone looking for a resemblance, they would have found it. He said, "How did the Bourbons come to know the details of Damien Pelletan's childhood?" "You think we have no contacts in Paris?" "I've no doubt you do. Although, as I recall, the Comte de Provence would have me believe those contacts somehow failed to tell him the purpose of Armand Vaudreuil's visit to London." Lachapelle simply gave a faint smile and shrugged. The plash of a wherryman's oars carried to them through the fog. When it came to powerful motives for murder, Sebastian suspected that preserving one's position in the line of succession to a throne probably ranked right up there near the top, even when the throne in question was temporarily occupied by a Corsican usurper. The reappearance of the lost Dauphin would completely overthrow the claims of the current aspirants to the French crown, and Marie-Thérèse's chances of someday becoming queen. "Of course," La Chapelle was saying, "there's no real proof, one way or the other." "To your knowledge?" "To my knowledge," La Chapelle conceded. "However, given what is at stake, the mere possibility might have been enough to put Peloton's life in danger." Sebastian watched the courtier shift his gaze to the piers at the base of the bridge, where the river churned and swirled in deadly eddies. If the Comte d'Artois had been in London, Sebastian would have suspected him in an instant, for the youngest of the three Bourbon brothers could be as cruel and vicious as he was vain and self-indulgent. But Artois was far away in Scotland, while, if the wheel-bound, uncrowned king himself were involved, Sebastian found it difficult to understand why La Chapelle would have believed himself the target of the attack in Birdcage Walk. Sebastian said, "Why try to kill you? I can understand killing Fouché and mutilating his body, in the hopes of frightening Vondroy into abandoning the peace negotiations. But why you? Because, perhaps, of what I know, or suspect? Someone told me of a child born to Lady Giselle during the Terror, an infant that did not survive. How did that baby die?" La Chapelle lifted his gaze to meet Sebastian's. He was a man who had witnessed life at its most barbaric, who had no illusions about his fellow men, or the depths of depravity of which they were capable. Yet Sebastian caught a glimpse of fear in his eyes, the kind of fear instinctive to all men when confronted with evidence of a certain kind of callous inhumanity that bordered on madness. "She smothered it." Chapter 50. Alexandre Sauvage was hunkered down beside the entrance to Gibson's surgery when Sebastian walked up to her. She had her head bent, her attention focused on the bandage she was wrapping around a ragged child's finger. He knew she saw him, for she stiffened, but she didn't look up, saying to the child, "Next time, Félicité, remember, geese bite." The little girl giggled, thanked her prettily, and ran off to join the gang of urchins waiting for her in the shadows of the tower. Alexandre Sauvage rose slowly to her feet and turned to face him. "Why are you here?" "We need to talk." The wind fluttered the locks of dark red hair framing her face, and she crossed her arms at her chest as if she were cold. She made no move to step into the surgery, but simply stared back at him with wide, unblinking eyes. He said, "Why didn't you tell me that Damien was only your half-brother?" "Only? You say that as if our different mothers should make him somehow less important to me? Is that what you're suggesting?" "No. I'm suggesting the fact that some people believed him to be the lost Dauphin of France might have had something to do with his murder. Why the bloody hell didn't you tell me?" "Mother of God, why should I bring up some ridiculous decades-old rumor? Damien was my brother, my half-brother, if you will. He was no Bourbon." "Are you so certain?" "Yes." "How old were you when your father brought Damien home?" Her eyes glittered with animosity. 14. "Yet you had never seen him before?" "No. I did not even know he existed." "You didn't find that odd?" "Then? Of course. Now." She shook her head. "No. His mother was a noblewoman. The birth would have been seen as something shameful, something to be hidden. Her parents cut off all contact between her and my father." "Did your brother ever talk to you about his mother?" "Not really. He remembered little of their life before prison. When the trauma of one's life becomes too great to deal with, The mind sometimes ceases remembering it. Was his ordeal traumatic? He and his mother spent years in prison, without light or proper food, in conditions considerably worse than those endured by Marie-Thérèse. And his mother was torn from his arms and killed. He never completely recovered from the experience, either physically or mentally. He had dreadful nightmares, and his legs were always weak. It's why he was never able to serve as a physician in the French army. And why he hated the dark. Yes. The implications of that fear, and the knowledge of how he had met his death, weighed heavily in the silence between them. Sebastian kept his gaze on her face. Your father has never said anything to suggest that he might have been involved in an attempt to save the Dauphin from the Temple prison. Good God, no! How many times must I tell you? Damien was my brother. Did your brother know about the speculation that he might, in fact, be the lost Dauphin? Of course he knew. Nothing would make him more furious. Sometimes anger is a product of a refusal to believe the truth. Not in this case. She went to stand beside an ancient stone watering trough set in front of the stepped-back facade of the neighbouring house. She still had her arms crossed, as if she were hugging herself, and her features had taken on the flatness of those who look into the distant past. She said, "When my father performed the autopsy on the body of the boy in the temple, he removed his heart. For nearly 20 years now he has kept that child's heart in a crystal vase in his study. Why would he do that if he knew the boy was an impostor? If he knew that the real Dauphin was alive and masquerading as his own son?" Perhaps he feared that he himself might have been deceived. I doubt the plan of substitution was his own. Knowing that he was simply one player in a much larger plot, he may not have known whom to trust, whom to believe. And so he took the heart on the off chance the dead boy might indeed have been the real son of Louis XVI? Is that what you're saying? But if what you are suggesting is true, then why not tell his own children? Why not tell Damien himself? For your protection, perhaps, said Sebastian. The very fact that he kept the child's heart suggests to me that your father retains some royalist sympathies. Did Damien? Hardly. He despised the Bourbons. As do you. As do I. She stared off down the lane to where the children were now tossing withered cabbage leaves at a pig in an effort to capture its interest. Her face was set in tight, hard lines, but he could see the telltale tick of a muscle along her jawline. He said, "In a sense, it doesn't really matter whether your brother was the lost Dauphin or not. All that matters is that someone believed he was. Someone who considered him a potential threat to the current line of succession to the French throne. A threat to be eliminated." She brought up one hand to press the fingertips against her lips. "You're saying that's why they took his heart? Because they thought he was a Bourbon? What are they planning to do with it? Enshrine it someday in the Val de Grace? As if he were another martyr of the Revolution, rather than a man they themselves murdered?" "I suspect they do consider him a martyr of the Revolution." "And the colonel with the French delegation, why kill him? Why gouge out his eyes?" To disguise the true motive behind Damien Pelleton's death, perhaps. To frighten Vaudreuil into abandoning peace negotiations that might end with Napoleon still on the throne of France? I'm not sure. She dropped her hands to her sides. Who? Which of the Bourbons do you think was behind this? I don't know. She studied his face, her eyes hard and searching. I don't believe it. When he said nothing, she expelled her breath in a harsh rush. Keep going over and over that dreadful night in my mind. The bitter, numbing cold, the glitter of the ice, the echo of our footsteps in the stillness. I keep trying to remember something, anything that might help.
but I can't.
You said you thought you heard footsteps behind you in the lane.
Yes?
One set of footsteps, or two?
Only one. Or at least only one close at hand. There may have been others farther in the distance.
A man's footsteps, or a woman's?
A man's. Of that I'm certain.
Why do you ask? I found the prints of a woman's shoe in the alley.
She shook her head. If there had been a woman there, I would have known it. I would have felt it.
Another man might have questioned her assurance, but not Sebastian. As acute as his senses of sight and hearing were, he had learned long ago to rely even more on those senses to which language had as yet given no name.
She said, "Surely you're not suggesting that Marie-Thérèse of France, or one of her ladies, stalked my brother through the wretched alleys of St. Catherine's and thrust a knife into his back?"
Sebastian shook his head. He didn't believe even Lady Giselle would do her own killing. She would leave the dirty work to men like the dark-eyed assassin who had attacked Sebastian outside Stokes Mandeville, a man Sebastian had once assumed was English, but whom he now realized could as easily be a Frenchman who had lived the last 20-odd years in this country, losing all trace of his native inflections. Yet he found himself coming back, as always, to that bloody imprint of a woman's shoe, and he was aware of a conviction that he was still missing something terribly important. And the time was running out. Chapter 51. That night a fierce wind blew in from the north, scattering the dense, choking fog that had smothered the city for days, and bringing with it a killing cold. Sebastian could hear the wind even in his sleep, a low, mournful cadence that joined with a chorus of inconsolable grief. He dreamt of sad-eyed women with flailing arms that reached up to the heavens as they cried out with an anguish born of empty wombs and empty cradles, even when the blood of their murdered infants stained their own hands. Then the wind became the thunder of the surf beating against a rocky shore, and he was a boy again, standing at the precipice of a sheer cliff face, the sun warm on his face as he stared out to sea, watching, waiting for a golden-haired, laughing woman who would never, ever return. He jerked awake, his eyes opening on the tucked blue silk of the tester above. He sat on the side of the bed, the breath coming hard in his chest, like a man standing against a gale so strong he had to fight to draw air. The room was filled with dancing shadows, the wind eddying the dying fire and shifting the heavy drapes at the window. He rose to his feet and went to throw more coal on the fire. The icy air bit his naked flesh, but he ignored it, standing with one hand resting on the mantel, his gaze on the leaping flames. He heard a soft whisper of movement from the bed, and Hero came to drape a blanket around his shoulders. He had returned home that evening to find her kneeling on the bed with her arms folded on the mattress and her forehead resting on her hands. She might not trust Alexandre Sauvage to manipulate the child in her womb, but she was desperate enough to spend 20 minutes every 2 hours in an ungainly posture that thus far had done nothing to encourage his recalcitrant offspring to assume a position best calculated to preserve her and her mother's life. She said, "You can't solve every murder, unravel every mystery, right every wrong." No. She gave a soft huff of disbelief. "You say that, but you don't really believe it." He gave a crooked smile. "No." She snuggled into the chair beside the fire, a quilt held close around her. "Do you seriously think it possible that Marie-Thérèse could be behind all this? When you're brought up to believe that you're descended from a saint, and that your family has been anointed by God to fill a position of limitless power and authority, it does tend to have a somewhat warping influence on your thought processes. even without the damage inflicted by 3 years of hell locked in a tower and guarded by men who hate you. Hero was silent for a moment, her eyes clouded by a troubling memory. "What?" he asked, watching her. "I was just thinking about a dinner party I attended a few years ago. Marie-Thérèse was there, and she told a story about her brother, about a time when Marie-Antoinette allowed the children to milk the cows at the P.3, and how the little Dauphin squealed with delight when he was accidentally squirted in the face with the warm, fresh milk. It's the only time I've ever seen her looking relaxed and vaguely happy. I think she remembers the days before the Revolution, when her mother and father and brother were all alive, as a golden age in her life, a sacred time of joy and love and serenity. If she genuinely thought Damien Pelletan was the lost Dauphin, I can't believe she would have had him killed. The others, perhaps, but not a man she believed to be her beloved little brother." "You could be right. It's possible she knows nothing about it. But that doesn't mean it wasn't done to benefit her." "By whom?" "I put my money on Lady Giselle." She blinked. "Can you prove it?" "Prove it? No. To be honest, I'm not even entirely convinced I'm right." He gave a wry smile. "It isn't as if I haven't been wrong before." She watched the flames lick at the new load of coal. "How do you explain the explosion at Golden Square? I mean, why would Lady Giselle try to kill Alexis Sauvage? Simply because she was there when Damien Pelletan was killed?" "It's possible, although I'm not convinced that the Bourbons had anything to do with what happened in Golden Square. That was probably Samson Bullock's handiwork." "Then how do you know he didn't kill Damien Pelletan, too?" "I don't. I'd probably think he did kill Pelletan if it weren't for the removal of Pelletan's heart. That, and the way everything seems to keep circling back to the Bourbon." "That doesn't mean they're to blame." "No. But they are involved. Somehow." She pushed up from the chair with the slow, stately grace that had come to characterize her movements of late. The dark fall of her hair glowed in the firelight, a soft smile curling her lips as she bracketed his cheeks with her hands, and kissed his mouth. He rested his hands on her hips, breathed in the familiar, heady scent that was all her own. He kissed her again, then leaned his forehead against hers as he felt his heart swell with a flood of love and joy, all tangled up with a fear more terrible than any he had ever known. Even after they had gone back to bed, and she had fallen asleep beside him, he found the night's shadows haunted by dreamlike images of empty arms and silent cradles. Friday, 29th of January. Early the next morning, Sebastian was coming down for breakfast when Moray opened the door to Lady Peter Ratcliffe. She carried an overstuffed satchel and had brought with her the child known to the world as her brother. He stood on the top step with his 2 wooden boats clutched to his chest. There was a pale, pinched look about his face, and he kept shivering as if he was so cold he might never warm up. Lady Peter wore a cherry-red velvet pelisse, with a high white fur collar and a silken bonnet, whose stiffened velvet brim hid her face. But when she turned her head, Sebastian saw the thin line of blood that trickled from her split lip, and the purple bruises that mottled and swelled her once pretty face. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice a cracked whisper. "I know I shouldn't have come here, but I didn't know where else to go." And then, as if she had been holding herself upright by a sheer act of will, her eyes rolled back in her head. Sebastian caught her, just before she hit the tiled marble floor. "I don't think she sustained any serious internal damage," Gibson said, keeping his voice low. although it wasn't for lack of trying on someone's part. Who did this to her? That would be her husband, the younger son of the 3rd Duke of Linford, and brother to the current 4th Duke. They were standing just outside the door to the darkened chamber where Lady Peter lay beneath a pile of warm quilts. Her eyes were closed, although Sebastian didn't think she was sleeping. Hero had carried off the boy Noel to the morning room, where she was plying him with milk and cookies and trying to coax the disgruntled black cat into being sociable. Gibson said, "I tried to get her to take some laudanum, but she refused. Perhaps you can convince her to change her mind." After Gibson left, Sebastian went to sit beside her. He watched her throat work as she swallowed and opened eyes that were swimming with unshed tears. Then she blinked, and one tear escaped to slip sideways into her hair. "It's all right," he said. "You're safe now." She shook her head, although whether it was to refute his statement or to deny her need for safety he couldn't have said. "Peter," she swallowed. "He never beat me like this before. Not this bad. In the past he was always careful to hurt me where it wouldn't show, but this time I thought he was going to kill me." "What set him off? Do you have any idea?" "He was out drinking most of the night and came home in a rage. He's badly dipped, you see, and his brother is refusing to pay his debts. The last time the Duke rescued him from Dun territory, he swore he'd never do it again. I knew he meant it, but Peter refused to believe it. Now he's getting desperate. He ran through everything I brought to the marriage years ago, and he wants to get his hands on what my father left for Noel. I told him I wouldn't help him to do it, but I'd rather die. That's when he started hitting me." She was silent for a moment, then said, "He called me such names. Said he'd put up with my bastard all these years, that the least I could do was help him now when he needed it." "He knows Noel is your son?" She nodded, the tears sliding freely down her cheeks. "I never deceived him." "Did you tell him Damien Peloton was the boy's father?" "No, but I think he might have guessed." Her fingers picked at the lace trimming of the sheets. "When Damien first begged me to go away with him, I told him I couldn't do it. I wanted to, but I'd made a vow, and I believed I owed it to Peter to honor it. But then—" Her voice faded away. Sebastian waited, and after a moment she swallowed and started up again. "Last Wednesday Noel left one of his boats lying in the entry hall. Peter tripped over it, and he turned around and backhanded Noel so hard he made his nose bleed. I couldn't believe it. Peter had never hit him before. But that's how it started with me. One day he lost his temper and slapped me across the face. He swore he'd never do it again. But he did. So I knew. I knew it would be the same all over again with Noel. That's when I realized I had to leave, with or without Damien." "So you told Damien you'd go with him when he left for France?" "Yes." "Is it possible Lord Peter discovered what you were planning?" "I don't know." Her face crumpled with the force of her sobs, splitting open the cut on her lip so that it began to bleed again. "He may have. Oh, God, has this all been my fault? Did Damien die because of me?" Sebastian knew most people in their society would blame her, whether Damien died because of her or not. She had borne a child out of wedlock, then conspired to leave her noble husband for her former lover. But he couldn't find it within him to either judge or condemn her for the tangle her life had become. She'd been young and vulnerable when she gave in to her passion and the enchantment of love, and unwisely created a child. Torn from the future that might have been hers, she was forced by her parents and the dictates of their society's stern, unforgiving sense of propriety to disown her own child, and marry a man who agreed to give her a veneer of respectability in exchange for her father's wealth. It was a contract she entered into in good faith, determined to honour the vows she made to a man whose easy geniality and practised charm hid an angry, self-indulgent, and ultimately abusive petulance. He said, "Lord Peter claims he was at home with you the night Damien was killed. Was he?" She shook her head from side to side against the pillow. "No. He was supposed to meet Brummel and Albany at White's for dinner that night, but he never showed up. He said he spent the night drinking in some low tavern in Westminster, and ended up getting into a brawl there. When he came home early the next morning, his clothes were covered in blood." "Was he hurt?" "No. I think his knuckles may have been skinned, but that was all." "Where is he now?" "I left him sleeping." She drew in a deep, ragged breath. "I've made such a mess of things. What am I to do?" Reaching out, Sebastian laid his hand over hers where it rested on the counterpane. "Right now, all you need to do is rest and get better." "Noel?" "Is petting our cranky black cat in the drawing-room." "He'll be fine. I should see him." "I'll have him come in after you've had some sleep." Her hand trembled beneath his, then lay still, and it occurred to him, as he watched her eyes close and her breathing deepen with sleep, that whoever had killed Damien Pelletan hadn't only robbed a caring young physician of his life, they'd also deprived a little boy of his father, and a lonely young woman of the chance to reach again for the gentle love and happiness that had been snatched from her so long ago. Chapter 52. Before he rang the bell of Lord Peter Radcliffe's townhouse in Half Moon Street, Sebastian loosened his cravat, tousled his hair, and splashed his face with some of the contents of the brandy bottle he held. Then he leaned one elbow against the door-frame, affected a slightly befuddled smile, and waited. Radcliffe's butler was a small, slim man with a mouthful of large, crooked teeth, and a long, sharp nose. He gazed at Sebastian with watery grey eyes and sniffed. "Ah, there you are," said Sebastian, staggering slightly as he straightened. "I'm here for Radcliffe." The butler sniffed again. "I'm afraid Lord Peter is not presently at home to visitors." "Still abed, is he?" Smiling cheerfully, Sebastian pushed past the startled butler and crossed the entrance hall toward the stairs. "That's quite all right. He won't mind me waking him." "But, my lord, you can't do that." Sebastian took the steps two at a time. "Not to worry. I can guarantee he'll be delighted to see me." Pausing halfway up the stairs, Sebastian swung around to hold the bottle aloft as if it were a rare prize. "What you see here is some of the best brandy never to pay a penny of tax into the coffers of good old King George." He pressed one finger to his pursed lips and winked. "But shh! Mum's the word, eh?" "My lord, please." "That will be all," called Sebastian gaily, running up the rest of the stairs. At the top of the second flight he threw open the doors of 2 rooms before finding the right one. The chamber lay in darkness, the heavy drapes at the windows closed tight to exclude all light. The space was large and square, furnished with a high tester and delicate Adam's chests, its pastel-hued walls accented with beribboned mouldings picked out in cream. The air reeked of stale sweat and despair, and the alcohol-tinged exhalations of the man who snored loudly from the depths of the bed. Sebastian closed the door behind him and locked it, then crossed the room to do the same to the door leading to the dressing-room. The man in the bed did not stir. Radcliffe's clothes lay scattered across the floor, where he had obviously discarded them on his wobbly path to the bed. First the cravat, then a meticulously tailored coat dropped on the floor with its sleeves inside out. Sebastian saw a waistcoat, its crumpled white silk front spattered with dried blood, and he felt a surge of rage that was like a hum in his ears. It was Julia's blood. The bottle still gripped in one fist, he went to stand beside Lord Peter. Sprawled on his back in a tangle of sheets, he had one bare leg dangling off the edge of the bed, his nightshirt rocked up around his hips. He lay with his face turned to one side, his golden hair plastered to his forehead with dried sweat, his lips pursed so that his breath whistled softly on its way out. Sebastian stared down at him for a moment, then crossed to the window and yanked open the drapes. The cold light of mid-morning flooded the room. Lord Peter gave a strangled half-snore, then resumed his previous cadence. Setting aside the bottle, Sebastian fisted both hands in the frilled front of the man's nightshirt. "Come on, up with you, then," he said as he hauled the drunken man's limp body out of the bed and swung him around to slam his back against the carved wooden post of the bed with enough force to rattle the frame. "What?" Radcliffe wavered, his eyes fluttering open, his mouth foolishly agape as his legs crumpled and he slid down against the side of the bed. Closing one hand around the brandy bottle's neck, Sebastian smashed it against the carved bedpost, raining down brandy and broken glass on the drunken man's head and shoulders. Radcliffe shook his head like a dog coming in out of a storm. "What the devil?" Crouching low, Sebastian grabbed another fistful of Radcliffe's nightshirt with one hand and pressed the sharp edge of the broken bottle up under the man's chin. "Give me one good excuse to slit your throat," he said, enunciating each word with awful clarity. "And believe me, I will. I've just had a surgeon to tend your wife's injuries. It's no thanks to you she's not dead." "Julia? What did the bitch say? If she told you—" Radcliffe let out a yelp as Sebastian increased the pressure on the sharp edge held against his throat. Don't ever let me hear you use a word like that to describe your wife again. Do I make myself understood? I have no mercy for a man like you. There's a special place in hell for a man who uses his fists on his own wife, and I'll be more than happy to send you there." Lord Peter stared up at him with bulging eyes. He might not be entirely sober, but he was now wide awake. "You're mad." "I may well be. I'm beginning to suspect that we all are, each in our own way. You can't come in here threatening me, acting like I'm some—" Sebastian shifted his weight in a way that made Lord Peter break off and draw a quick, shallow breath. Sebastian said, "In case you haven't noticed, I am already here. Where you made your mistake was in lying to me. You told me you spent last Thursday night at home with your wife. You didn't. You got into a row with her. You were angry about her renewed acquaintance with an old childhood friend. It wasn't simply some old friend. He was her lover. 9 years ago, not now. Is that what she told you?" "Yes. And I believe her." Sebastian let his gaze drift over the other man's face, slick with sweat and slack now with the after-effects of too much alcohol and too little sleep. "Is that why you followed Peloton to St. Catherine's and stuck a knife in his back?" "I didn't. I swear I didn't. I won't deny I was angry. What man wouldn't be? I even went to the inn where the bastard was staying. I was going to tell him that Julia is my wife and he'd better stay the hell away from her. But I didn't even do that." "Why not?" "Because when I got there he was standing on the footpath outside the inn talking to Lady Giselle." Sebastian stared at him. "Are you telling me you saw Damien Peloton talking with Lady Giselle Edmondson?" Radcliffe looked puzzled by Sebastian's vehemence. "That's right." "Why? How do you know the woman you saw was Lady Giselle?" "Because I recognized her. How do you think?"
She was wearing a hat with a veil, but she'd pushed back the veil, and the light from the oil lamp beside the door was falling full on her face.
Did you hear anything of what was said?
No, of course not. What the bloody hell do you think I am? I don't go around eavesdropping on other people's private conversations.
Was there a man with her?
There was, but I couldn't tell you who. He stayed in the background.
So then what happened?
I don't know. I left.
You left? Why?
At first I planned to wait in the shadows until she went away and then confront him. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized that would be a mistake.
Oh? Why?
Because I'm not a killer, or whatever you may think, and I realized that if I approached him then in the rage I was in, I might very well murder him. So I left. I won't say I'm sorry the bastard is dead, because I'm not. But he didn't die at my hand.
Where did you go after you left York Street?
I don't know. I wandered the streets for a while, I couldn't say for how long. I ended up in a low tavern somewhere in Westminster. At one point I got into a brawl with a drunk who drew my cork. Then I spent what was left of the night in a back room with a whore I wouldn't even recognize if I saw her again.
Sebastian studied Lord Peter's haggard face. He'd said he had no mercy for men like Radcliffe, but that wasn't exactly true. If not mercy, then he at least acknowledged a measure of pity, even though he knew it was probably misplaced. In his own way, Lord Peter was a victim of a society that valued show above substance, birth above real worth, a victim of a hereditary system that brought up younger sons in an indulgent, pampered atmosphere, even as it tormented them with the knowledge that the vast estates and palatial homes they enjoyed as children would never be theirs. And he was a victim of his own weakness, the recognition of which led him to strike out in anger and frustration at his wife, when what he really wanted more than anything else was to be admired and indulged and loved. Sebastian said, "Listen to me carefully, because I'm going to say this only once. Your wife is going to leave you, and you are going to let her."
"What? You've no right to—"
Radcliffe made a strangling sound as Sebastian subtly shifted the broken edge of the bottle against his throat. "If your debts are as pressing as I suspect they are, you might consider fleeing the country. I hear America is a good place for people looking to start over." Radcliffe's face contorted with revulsion.
"America?"
"Frankly, I couldn't care less where you go. But you will make no attempt to contact your wife or her son again. And if I ever hear of you laying a hand on her, I'll kill you. It's that simple. Do I make myself clear?"
"What does it matter to you what happens to her?"
"It matters," said Sebastian, and let him go. Sebastian walked back down the stairs and out of the house, only dimly aware of the butler, 2 housemaids, and a footman peering at him wide-eyed from around the door-frames as he passed. Outside, the air smelled of coal smoke and the coming rain. He paused on the footpath, his gaze on the jumble of rooftops and chimney-stacks that jutted up dark against a grey sky. Was Radcliffe lying? Sebastian doubted it. Men like Radcliffe were basically cowards. They beat their wives because it gave them a sense of power and control so sorely lacking in other aspects of their lives. Sebastian couldn't see a man like that somehow finding the courage to stalk a rival through the cold, dark alleys of St. Catherine's and then cut out his heart in some twisted ritual of symbolism and revenge. But what occupied Sebastian's thoughts as he turned toward the home of the Comte d'Artois in South Audley Street was the vital piece of information Lord Peter had unknowingly provided. Sebastian had believed that Marie-Thérèse and Lady Giselle passed the night of Damien Peloton's murder closeted together in prayer for the martyred King Louis XVI. He'd thought their role in Peloton's death, if it existed at all, had been limited to directing their minions from afar. Now, he wasn't so sure. Chapter 53. Sebastian wouldn't have been surprised if Lady Giselle refused to see him. But he underestimated her. She sent word that she would be down in a few moments, although, instead of having him escorted to the drawing-room, she met him in a small book-lined chamber on the ground floor that looked as if it might be devoted to the use of a steward, or man of business. She wore a simple gown of dove-grey wool trimmed with black ribbon. Her fair hair fell in gentle curls about her delicate face. A plain band of black velvet encircled her long, delicate neck. Her only jewellery was a small gold watch pinned to her breast, and a dainty pair of pearl earrings. "Lord Devlin," she said, holding out her hand to him, her smile one of warmth that hinted at a secret shared. "Forgive me for receiving you here, but Marie-Thérèse is in the drawing-room. I fear the very mention of your name is still enough to send her into spasms." "Thank you for agreeing to see me, particularly under such circumstances. Please, have a seat. Have you discovered something of interest?" He took the seat she indicated, a red leather desk chair with worn wooden arms. "I have, actually. I was wondering, where did you and Marie-Thérèse spend a week ago Thursday? I know you devoted the day to prayer for her father the king, but were you here, in London, or at Hartwell House?" A vague shadow passed her face. It was there and gone so quickly he couldn't identify it. Apprehension, perhaps? Calculation? Or simply remembered sorrow? "Here," she said. "We had come up to London several days before, so that Marie-Thérèse might consult with Dr. Pelletan. We left for Hartwell House again early Friday morning." I should tell you that I now know why Marie-Thérèse was so anxious to consult with Damien Pelletan. It had nothing to do with his reputation as a physician, and everything to do with the fact that his father first brought Damien home the very summer the little Dauphin died in the Temple prison. I think the princess knew about the rumours that he might be the lost Dauphin, and she wanted to see him so that she could judge for herself whether or not he was her brother. There was a long pause, during which Lady Giselle's face showed not a hint of consternation or alarm. She simply gave a small, sad smile and said, "You are right, of course. Marie-Thérèse has never given up hope that her brother might one day be found alive. You've no notion the number of pretenders she has interviewed over the years, each time working herself into a frenzy of anticipation, only to be cast down with disappointment at the realization that she has once more been deceived. But Damien Pelletan never claimed to be the lost Dauphin." "He did not, no, which was one of the reasons she was particularly anxious to see him." "And what was her conclusion?" "To be frank, she found him so much like her dead mother that she was overcome with emotion. It had been her intention to ask him a series of probing questions about his past, but she was so distraught that she found she could not. I had to take her away." "Is that why you went back to see Pelletan again on Thursday night?" He expected her to deny it, but she was too clever for that, and he realized she'd probably guessed from the beginning what his questions were leading up to, and why. She tilted her head to one side, her gaze intent on his face. "How did you know?" "You were recognized." "Ah." When she remained silent, he said, "You told me you spent the day in prayer with Marie-Thérèse. Why not tell the truth?" "It seemed best at the time. Now I realize it was a mistake. Forgive me." "Am I to understand that for the first time in 18 years you deserted the princess on the anniversary of her father's death?" She shook her head. "No,
I fear there are times when Marie-Thérèse's grief simply becomes too much for her. When she reaches that point, she is impossible to calm, and can make herself ill. In such situations, sleep becomes the only reasonable recourse. In other words, Lady Giselle had dosed the hysterical princess with laudanum. Now she sat with her fingers laced together in her lap, her features composed in an expression of calm beatitude that would have done justice to Saint Louis himself. She said, Marie-Thérèse had asked me to return and see Peloton, to ask the question she herself had been unable to broach. And so I did. What did you discover? Very little, actually. He became quite angry when he realized why I was there, and refused to discuss the subject any further. So we left. We. A faint note of exasperation crept into her voice. You don't seriously think I would undertake such a visit alone, do you? My mother's cousin, the Chevalier d'Armitz, was kind enough to accompany me. Again that charming tilt of the head as her pretty forehead crinkled with a show of confusion. Why are you asking me these questions? Because you and your cousin were amongst the last people to see Damien Peloton alive. What was he doing when you left the inn? She shrugged. The last I saw, he was standing on the footpath outside the inn, staring up at the night sky. As I said, the conversation visibly disturbed him. He may have been trying to compose himself before returning inside. Did you see anyone else while you were there? We spoke to a servant in the coffee room, if that's what you mean, but I don't recall noticing anyone else. What about your cousin, the Chevalier d'Armitz? He might have noticed someone. Would it be possible for me to speak to him? I'm sorry, but I believe he's away from London at the moment. A pity, said Sebastian. Yes, it is, isn't it? Tell me about him. She smiled and gave a little shrug. What is there to tell? Has he been in England long? Most of his life. He's young? In his 20s, yes. She glanced at the watch pinned to her bodice. Sebastian had outstayed his welcome, and she was not hesitant to let him know it. She rose to her feet. And now I fear you must excuse me, my lord. We plan to return to Hartwell House in the morning, and Marie-Thérèse has expressed an interest in making one last expedition to Bond Street. Sebastian rose with her, his hat in one hand. Best hurry, then, he said. It looks as if it's liable to come on to rain. Hopefully not until after midnight, she said, smiling sadly. I've a private service at the chapel to attend this evening. He studied her delicate, fine-featured face. She was a beautiful woman, still young enough to bear children, and well-dowered enough to attract suitors, had she wanted them. Instead, she had devoted her life to the support of a fragile, damaged princess, regarded by the indulgent as haughty and high-strung, and by the less charitable as half-mad. Aloud, he said, "Why have you stayed with Marie-Thérèse all these years?" "Because she needs me," Lady Giselle said simply. "When she was released from prison 18 years ago, I promised I would stay with her until the Bourbons are restored to their rightful place on the throne of France. I am a woman of my word." "And if there never is a Bourbon restoration?" She looked at him with the clear, steady conviction of a Joan of Arc, or the kind of officials who once burned witches at the stake. "There will be. It is God's will." "Divine right of kings and all that." Her jaw tensed. "You can scoff if you like. But the fact remains that God has bestowed earthly sovereignty on the Bourbons, just as he has given spiritual sovereignty to his Pope. That is why no monarch can be subject to earthly authority, for his right to rule derives from God's own will, not from his subjects. Any attempt by those subjects to depose their lawful king or curtail his power in any way is an affront to God, and thus cannot long endure. The United States of America seems to be enduring just fine. Yet the French Revolution endured for how long? Little more than a decade. I doubt Napoleon will last much longer. Napoleon's mistake is the same as the Bourbon. He is trying to stand against the tide of history. The age of monarchs is passing. Even if Napoleon is defeated and the Bourbon restored by the armies of Russia and Britain, they won't last for long. She held herself stiffly. I'd no notion you were so radical in your thinking, my lord. Somehow she managed to turn the my lord into a mockery, which he supposed in a way it was, although she didn't know that. What do you believe in, then? The rights of man? Actually, there's very little I believe in. He had been deliberately trying to provoke her, and he had succeeded far better than he had anticipated. But now she seemed to become aware of the extent to which she had betrayed herself. She blinked, and the steely moral certainty that had inspired the likes of Cotton Mather, Oliver Cromwell, and Maximilien Robespierre slid behind the careful assumption of calm good humour that typically characterized her. She said, I think you believe in far more than you give yourself credit for, my lord. Perhaps. She walked with him to the entrance hall, nodding quietly to the butler, who moved to open the front door. Tell me, my lord, she said, pausing beside him, are you any closer to discovering who is behind these dreadful murders? I believe I may be, yes. Indeed? Then hopefully soon we may all sleep better in our beds. Have you been afraid? He asked, his gaze on her face. Fear has been our constant companion for many years. I don't think you need worry about this. Yet you will let us know if you discover anything more? Of course. A woman's voice floated down from upstairs. Giselle, où es-tu? You must excuse me, my lord. She gave a slight bow. And thank you again. He watched her move away, her tranquil self-possession once more firmly in place. He did not for an instant believe she was losing sleep due to fear of some brutal murderer prowling the streets of London. But he could believe she was worried, for a very different reason entirely. Chapter 54. Sebastian walked the cold, rain-washed streets of Mayfair and tried to think. Would a woman who believed in the divine right of kings plot to kill a young man she thought might be the only surviving son of Louis XVI of France? On the surface, the answer seemed to be no. And yet, this was a woman who had dedicated her life to the restoration of the Bourbon dynasty, not to the restoration of a certain frail young prince who may or may not have died in the Temple prison. If she considered Damien Peloton a threat to the eventual accession of Marie-Thérèse and her husband to the throne of France, would Lady Giselle kill him? Sebastian believed she would. What had Alexis Sauvage said about her brother? Damien despised the Bourbon. Had he expressed those sentiments to Lady Giselle? If he had, it might well have led to his death. The family trees of Europe's royal houses were littered with kings who had fallen victim to a usurper's hand, fathers murdered by sons, nephews by uncles, cousins by cousins. How did Lady Giselle explain such irregularities, he wondered? As the divine wisdom of Providence worked in mysterious ways? Probably. Those who believed God was on their side all too often found it easy to kill in his name, secure in the comfortable certitude of their own righteousness. And yet his imagination still balked at the image of Lady Giselle and her cousin, the unknown chevalier, stalking Damien Peloton through the mean streets of St. Catherine's on one of the coldest nights of the year. Sebastian knew he was still missing something. The question was, what?
He kept coming back to the image of Damien Pelletan standing before the Gifford Arms, his head thrown back, his gaze on the cold night sky above. How many people knew Damien and Alexis Sauvage intended to visit Hangman's Court that night? Lady Giselle? No, she was gone by the time Alexandre arrived. Lord Peter? Possibly, if he had lingered longer than he claimed. Jarvis's man? Again, possibly, if he'd been close enough to overhear their conversation. Armand Vondroy? Again, possibly. Samson Bullock? Sebastian paused. The wind gusted up, cold and damp against his face, and carrying with it all the smells of the city. Could Samson Bullock have known that Alexis Sauvage and her brother were headed for Hangman's Court that night? Yes, Bullock had been following and watching her for days. What if he learned of not only her plans to visit St. Catherine's, but also her intent to ask her brother to accompany her? Two things about this convoluted string of murders kept tripping Sebastian up: the bloody print left in the alley by a woman's shoe, and the brutal murder of the Frenchman, Fouché. Combined with the attack on Serena in Birdcage Walk, the latter seemed to suggest either the Bourbon or some other enemy of Napoleon's peace proposals. Yet how could either be linked to the explosion in Golden Square? If Alexis Sauvage were able to identify her brother's killer, she would have been murdered with him. Yet an idea was forming in Sebastian's mind, an explanation that accounted for these discrepancies, and more. It was time he had another talk with Mr. Mitt Peebles. Sebastian arrived at the Gifford Arms to find a dray half-loaded with trunks drawn up outside the inn, its mule standing with legs splayed and heads dipped in the cold wind. Mitt Peebles, wearing his leather apron and at his most officious, was directing two workmen carrying a handsome campaign desk out of the inn door. "Careful there now," he called as one of the men bumped into the door frame. "What's all this?" asked Sebastian, walking up to him. "We're leaving. What's left of 'em, that is. Guess they figure they'd best get out while the getting is good." "You heard another of 'em was found dead?" "Had his eyes gouged out." "Who'd do something like that? Ain't no Englishman, if you ask me." "Are you saying Armand Vondroy is returning to France?" "Well, can't say I know for certain where he's going, but I can guess, can't I?" Sebastian watched the workman maneuver the desk into the back of the dray. "I wonder, are you familiar with a cabinet maker by the name of Samson Bullock?" "Bullock?" Mitt paused, his saggy-jowled face going blank as he pondered the question. "Don't believe so, no." "He's a giant of a man, tall and big-boned, with curly black hair he wears long. Ever see him hanging around the inn?" Mitt shook his head. "Not so's I recall, no." "Why, you think he may be the one doing all this?" "At this point, I don't really know." Mitt grunted, his protuberant eyes watering in the cold wind. "All I hope is that word don't get out linking these goings-on to the inn. Won't do to have folks thinking the place is hexed. Won't do at all." Sebastian watched the two porters head back into the hotel. "Is Monsieur Vondroy about?" "Aye, in the coffee-room, last I saw him." Sebastian walked into the coffee-room to find Vondroy and his clerk, Bondurant, standing beside one of the tables near the front windows. They had a tan leather case open on the tabletop, and appeared to be verifying the papers it contained. Bondurant glanced over at Sebastian, then silently thrust the last of the papers into the case, buckled it, and left the room. "I hear you're leaving," said Sebastian, staring after the clerk. Vondroy swiped one hand across his lower face. His eyes were red-rimmed and puffy. "You blame me?" "No. But what about the negotiations?" The Frenchman shrugged. "They weren't exactly going anywhere."
Sebastian went to stand with his back to the fire. "When I saw you yesterday morning, you were determined to stay. What changed your mind?" "My daughter. She insisted I needed some slippery elm for a sore throat I've been complaining of, and walked down to the apothecary's yesterday afternoon to get it. Someone followed her." "Did she see him?" "No. The fog was too thick. All she heard was footsteps and then a man's cough. But she had no doubt he was following her. He stopped when she stopped, then started up again when she moved on. She ran the rest of the way back to the inn."
Sebastian studied the other man's drawn face.
"Who do you think is doing this? The Bourbon, perhaps? Some industrialist or financier like that Scotsman Kilmartin? Who can say? All I know is I've had enough." "What about Jarvis? Any chance he could be behind the killings?" "No." "So certain?"
Vondroy turned toward the window, his gaze on the workmen, who were now loading a pile of bandboxes into the wagon.
"Am I certain?" "No, I suppose not," he said after a moment. "There's no denying that Jarvis plays a deep game, a deep and dangerous game. It's reached the point I don't trust anyone any more."
He gave a humorless huff of laughter.
"And pray don't bother to point out the irony of my saying that, because, believe me, I see it. The only person with nothing to be ashamed of in all this is Madeleine, and I want her safely out of it."
"When does your ship sail?"
"At 10 this evening." "Then if you'll take my advice, you will get your daughter aboard quickly and stay in your cabin until the ship has cleared Greenwich."
The sound of a woman's footsteps on the stairs drew Vondroy's gaze to the entrance passage.
"But why would anyone want to harm my daughter? Who would do such a thing?"
Madame Madeleine Quesnel appeared at the entrance to the coffee-room. She wore a black wool carriage gown and carried a travelling reticule in her hand. Her gaze went from her father to Sebastian. Sebastian said,
"When the destinies of nations are at stake, some men will stop at nothing."
"Some men and some women." He swept her a bow and smiled.
"Have a safe voyage, madame."
Chapter 55. The last of the light was leaching from the sky when Charles, Lord Jarvis, crossed the forecourt of Carlton House towards his waiting carriage. He was feeling mildly pleased with the recent progression of events. There would be no peace negotiations with the impudent upstart Napoleon. That avaricious little opportunist Vondroy was at that very moment scurrying toward home with his tail between his legs. The war in Europe would continue to its proper end, with a triumphant host of British troops marching down the Champs-Élysées, and the forces of radicalism utterly crushed. Not for a century or more would any nation rise up to threaten Britain's global dominance, nor would any populace again dare to overthrow their betters and proclaim the rights of the vulgar masses. He paused while a footman hastened to open his carriage door and let down the steps. Settling comfortably on the plush seat, Jarvis was spreading the carriage robe across his lap when the door opened again and Viscount Devlin leapt up to take the seat opposite.
"Mind if I ride along?"
"Actually, yes."
The Viscount smiled.
"I won't stay long. I take it you've heard that Monsieur Armand Vondroy is leaving London?"
"I have."
"Was that your doing?"
"Not entirely."
"But you did send someone to follow his daughter."
Jarvis leaned back in his seat and simply raised his eyebrows.
Devlin said, "Vondroy thinks you killed Peloton and Fouché."
"Armand Vondroy is a venal, foolish man. Why would I bother to indulge in such ghoulish theatrics when I already had the head of the delegation on my payroll?"
"Perhaps Peloton and Fouché threatened to expose Vondroy to Paris."
"Ah, in that case, they most definitely would have needed to be eliminated. However, to my knowledge, Fouché at least remained blithely ignorant of Vandroy's treasonous activities. And, as you know, my knowledge is quite extensive.
Devlin stared out of the carriage window at a ragged young crossing sweep leaping out of their way.
You told me once that you had a man watching the Gifford Arms the night Peloton was killed. Yes? Tell me again what he saw.
Jarvis sighed.
Really, Devlin, this obsession of yours is becoming rather tiresome. Humour me. Very well. Let's see. An unidentified man and a veiled woman arrived by carriage, for reasons doubtless understood better by you than by my informer. Peloton elected to speak with them outside the inn rather than inside. The exchange was heated, but since my agent unfortunately lacks your acute hearing, the subject of that conversation remains unknown.
And then what happened?
The man and woman returned to their carriage, leaving Peloton on the pavement in something of a passion. He was still standing there when Alexandre Sauvage arrived. They also quarrelled. Peloton then returned to the inn and came out again, wearing a greatcoat and gloves, after which he and Sauvage went off in a hackney.
Jarvis was aware of Devlin sitting forward, his lips parted.
"What?" asked Jarvis, looking at him with disfavour. "And the man and the first woman. You said they'd returned to their carriage. When did they drive away?" "Immediately after Peloton and his sister left in a hackney." "You're certain?"
Jarvis was known for his flawless memory. It was one of his greatest assets, for he could recall conversations and reports verbatim, long after their occurrence had faded from other men's minds.
At the Viscount's question, he simply curled his lip in contempt.
Devlin said,
"Tell your coachman to pull up." "Gladly."
The Viscount started to jump down, then paused, with his hands braced against the doorframe, to look back and ask, "Are you by chance familiar with a young French émigré named the Chevalier d'Armitz?"
"Vaguely. Why?"
"Can you describe him for me?"
"Above medium height, stocky, dark hair."
"What do you know of him?"
"Very little. He forms one of that horde of émigrés attached to the Bourbon. He killed a man once, and I don't mean in a duel. Some captain in the Home Guard accused Armitz of cheating, and later that night was found stabbed in the back."
"Interesting. He's tried to kill me twice."
"What a pity that he didn't succeed,"
said Jarvis. But Devlin only laughed. Hero stood at the nursery window, one hand resting on the crest of her belly, her gaze on the dark storm clouds gathering over the city. She had come here often over the past 6 months, to supervise the workmen preparing the rooms, to indulge in some uncharacteristically maudlin reveries, and lately in search of quiet solace. But tonight she was smiling. She had spent 15 to 20 minutes every 2 hours for the better part of 2 days on her knees, telling herself she was a gullible fool, and yet doing it anyway. And then, when she'd been about to give it up in disgust, she felt a sensation akin to a giant fish doing a somersault in a tight barrel. Over the past several months she'd become familiar with the movements of her child, and so she knew, even without being told, that Alexis Sauvage's bizarre suggestion had worked. The babe had finally turned, and her chances of surviving the coming birth with a living child had just soared. Hero knew no one would ever describe her as a humble woman. She was proud, impatient, and opinionated. But she was also not above owning up to an error. And as she watched the last of the daylight fade from the sky, she knew she owed Sauvage both an apology and a heartfelt expression of gratitude. Intent on ordering her carriage and setting out for Tower Hill, Hero was about to turn from the window when a movement caught her eye. A man stood in the shadow of a cart drawn up across the street. He was a big man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in the clothes of a tradesman,
with a battered hat pulled low over dark curly hair worn too long. In the gathering gloom, his features were indistinct, yet she couldn't shake the impression he was staring at the house with a level of malevolence that was almost palpable. "Claire," she said to the Frenchwoman, who was folding clothes into a chest in the small room off the nursery, "do you see that man, there, near the cart? Do you know who he is?" Claire Bissett came to stand beside her, a chemise held in her hands. "No, I've never seen him before." "Why?" But Heroes simply shook her head, unwilling to admit to a sense of foreboding for which she had no real basis. Leaving the nursery, she sent word to the stables to have her barouche brought around, then changed into a carriage dress of green gros de Naples with a Van-Dyked shoulder cape trimmed in black. By the time she left the house, an icy wind had kicked up. The lamplighter and his boy hurrying to touch flame to the last of the oil lamps that stretched in a line toward Grosvenor Square. They caught her eye as the footman was handing her up into her carriage. And for a moment she saw the man again, tall and dark, with long black hair and a scar across one cheek, standing near the corner of Davies Street. Then he drew back, the wind fluttering a torn page of newspaper in the gutter, and bringing her the scent of the coming rain. Chapter 56. By the time Sebastian reached the French chapel on Little George Street, a fine cold rain had begun to fall from out of a heavy black sky. He paused in the shadows cast by the jutting angle of the nearby stables. The night smelled of wet pavement and fresh horse droppings, and hot oil from a distant street lamp flickering in the wind. A faint light spilled from the church facade's 3 high windows, and from the carriage lanterns of the lone barouche drawn up before the chapel portal. A coachman, wearing the livery of the Comte d'Artois, dozed on the carriage's high seat, but otherwise the narrow street lay dark and deserted beneath the coming storm. Settling his hat low against the rain, Sebastian gently tried the front doors of the chapel. They were locked. He glanced again at the sleeping coachman, then slipped around the side of the chapel to the narrow passageway that led to the sacristy door. The rain was falling harder now, sharp, needle-like drops with the sting of sleet. He'd almost reached the short flight of steps when he heard the stealthy footsteps of someone entering the passage behind him. Sebastian whipped around. A young man dressed in an unbuttoned greatcoat and a top hat drew up abruptly with a faint, nervous laugh. He looked to be perhaps 25 years of age, his features unremarkable, except for a pair of large, dark eyes as thickly lashed as a girl's. "The Chevalier d'Armitz, I take it?" "Yes." "You were being very quiet," said Sebastian. "You weren't by chance trying to sneak up on me, were you?" "No. Why would I want to do that?" The Frenchman held his left arm straight down at his side, his hand half hidden by the folds of his coat. In the deep shadows of the passage he must have been confident that no man could possibly see the dagger clenched in his fist. "Just thought you ought to know that the church is closed." "I see candlelight." The Chevalier advanced one step, then another. "It's a private ceremony." "Oh? And what sort of ceremony might that be?" "A funeral." "Yet there is no hearse." "The body has already been buried elsewhere." The rain drummed around them. The Chevalier kept coming, the knife held out of sight, his features composed in an affable expression, as if they were engaged in a pleasant conversation. "It is the practice amongst certain émigré families to preserve a loved one's heart separate from the body. The urns are kept in a vault here, in the chapel, for the day when they may be returned to France." "In this case, to the Val-de-Grâce?" "As it happens, yes." He drew up perhaps 4 feet from Sebastian, his smile slowly fading into something intense. "You are a difficult man to kill, Monsieur le Vicomte." "Yet you keep trying." "The odds are better this time, I think.
"Oh, because you have a knife in your hand and I don't."
A faint cloud of surprise, followed by uncertainty, drifted across the Chevalier's face, then cleared.
"I've heard you have the eyes and ears of a cat. I never credited it myself." "Your mistake."
He shook his head.
"I think it's an image you cultivate."
"I've heard you have a fondness for stabbing men in the back, literally.
Yet my back is not turned." "I'm adaptable," said the Chevalier.
Still smiling, he lunged forward, the knife flashing up towards Sebastian's heart. Sebastian pivoted to grab the Chevalier's outthrust arm with one hand while grasping his fist with the other. Gritting his teeth, Sebastian twisted the fist hard, the knife handle giving him leverage. He saw the flash of shock in Darmitz's face as the Frenchman realized just how badly he had miscalculated. The knife slid from the Chevalier's helplessly limp hand into Sebastian's own. Yanking up the Frenchman's arm, Sebastian drove the blade straight into his heart. "But," sputtered the Chevalier, eyes widening as he smacked into a reality he could not finesse, an opponent he could not cheat, a fate he could not elude. Then fury replaced astonishment. An indignant rage made all the more acute by the realization that his luck had finally run out. "Not quite as adaptable as you thought," said Sebastian, wrenching the blade free. The rain poured around them, wetting the Frenchman's upturned face and mingling with the blood soaking his white waistcoat. The light of comprehension was already fading from his eyes. Yet the rage remained, like a fiery hot coal, doomed to extinction in an unforgiving darkness. The door to the sacristy opened soundlessly to Sebastian's touch. The space beyond was small and untidy, the air thick with the smell of dampness and stale incense, and a musty odour often associated with old men's clothes. A narrow band of flickering candlelight spilled into the dark room through the door to the chapel itself, which stood slightly ajar. Sebastian paused in the shadows. From here he could see most of the 2 rows of empty benches and the wooden west gallery built above the main entrance. The church appeared deserted, except for the old priest, clothed in his white alb, with a gold-embroidered black stole draped around his neck. He stood before one of the wall-mounted monuments, now open to reveal a shallow niche containing a row of urns. He had his hands raised, the low drone of his voice echoing through the stillness. "Requiem aeternam doni ei, Domine." Sebastian heard a rustle of cloth, a light step, and Lady Giselle Edmondson moved into his line of vision. She wore a high-waisted gown of black cashmere, scalloped and edged with crape. A black lace veil draped her head, the delicate folds accentuating the fair lustre of her hair without hiding her face. In her hands she held a clear rock crystal urn mounted with 2 silver handles and a silver lid and base. Within lay a red-brown heart he suspected had once belonged to Damien Peloton. "Et lux perpetua luceat ei." She stood with her head bowed, her eyes closed, her beautiful features composed into a study of intense concentration and reverence as the words of the priest washed over her. "Requiescat in pace." Sebastian shifted so that his view took in the rest of the chapel. He half expected to find Marie-Thérèse here as well. But the church was utterly empty, except for the aged priest and Lady Giselle. "Anima ejus, et animae omnium fidelium, de functorum per misericordiam." The priest's chanting was reaching a crescendo. Sebastian pushed the door open wider and walked into the chapel. "Dei requiescant in pu—" The priest's head turned, his voice trailing off into a high-pitched squeak as his eyes widened and his jaws sagged. At first, Giselle must have assumed Sebastian's footsteps belonged to her cousin. for she turned slowly, her head coming up as she opened her eyes. Her reaction was more controlled than the priest's. She stared at Sebastian for a moment, then said, "I take it that's my cousin's blood?" It was only then that Sebastian became aware of the spurt of dark blood across the front of his coat and waistcoat, and the bloody knife he still clenched in one hand. "It is." "He's dead?" "He is, yes." He saw the flame of emotion in her eyes, fury mingled with careful calculation rather than grief. "Monsieur!" protested the priest, "you would bring a bloody weapon of murder into the house of the Lord?" "My apologies, Father." Keeping his gaze on Lady Giselle, Sebastian carefully laid the knife at his feet, the metal hilt clinking against the stone paving. She said, "I am aware of what you must think, but you are wrong. The Chevalier did not kill Damien Pelletan." "I know." Sebastian continued walking toward her, his empty hands at his sides. "But you intended to kill him. That's why you followed his hackney when he left the Gifford Arms that night, isn't it?" "Perhaps. Yet in the end, what we intended is immaterial. If all those who wished ill of their fellow beings were held accountable, England would soon be very thin of company." "So what did happen that night?" She shrugged. "When the hackney set Pelletan and the woman down at the entrance to Cat's Hole, I told my coachman to pull up and sent the Chevalier to follow them on foot." "To Hangman's Court?" "If that is the name of that foul cesspit, then the answer is yes." "And then what?" "While our midst waited, he became aware of another man loitering in the shadows. A large, rather crude ruffian with dark, curly hair. Samson Bullock." "Yes?" Sebastian studied her calm, flawlessly composed features. "How did you know his name?" "Does it matter? The point is, Armitz watched Bullock follow Pelletan as he left Hangman's Court. At one point, the woman must have heard something, because she started to turn. Bullock struck her in the head with a coche and stabbed Damien Pelletan in the back. Armitz waited until the man left, then came to me." "And you returned together to where Damien Pelletan and his sister lay?" She tilted her head to one side. "How did you—" "How did I know you were there in the alley?" "I found the prints left by your shoes." "But you could not possibly have known the shoe prints were mine." "No," he agreed, then said, "Why did you return with Armitz to Cat's Hole?" Her hands moved possessively over the crystal urn in her hands. "I needed the heart." Sebastian studied the proud lift of her chin, the gleam of self-confident righteousness in those deceptively soft blue eyes. "You cut out his heart yourself, didn't you? That's why you went back with Armitz. He couldn't bring himself to do it. So you did." "Yes." He'd known it, and yet hearing her calmly admit it made the fact seem somehow worse. He could not rid himself of the image of this delicate, ethereally beautiful woman surrounded by the refuse of a dark, foul alley as she savagely hacked Damien Pelletan's heart from his still warm flesh. He said, "You believed Pelletan the lost Dauphin, the only surviving son of the martyred King of France, and yet you would have killed him had someone else not done so first. Why?" She stared back at him. He was not fit to rule. He was not raised as a prince, and his mind had been hopelessly corrupted by the influence of the Revolution. When the Bourbons are restored to the throne of France, it will not be through him. Yet you would see his heart given a place of honor amongst the royal tombs in Val-de-Grâce? He is still a son of Saint-Louis. Does Marie-Thérèse know? Does she know you would have killed the man she believed might be her brother? Rather than answer him, Lady Giselle turned to the priest. "Please continue the service, Father." To Sebastian she said, "You may leave us now."
Sebastian expelled his breath in a low, humorless huff. "Not without Damien Peloton's heart. It's up to his sister to decide what's to be done with it."
"No."
She shook her head. "His name was not Damien Peloton, and the woman who accompanied him was not his sister." "You're wrong," said Sebastian, advancing on her. He could probably never prove that the Chevalier d'Armitz had killed both Colonel Fouché and the Molly James Farragut, just as there was no way to prove that the Chevalier had acted under this woman's orders. But he'd be damned if he'd let her enshrine Damien Peloton's heart in a monument dedicated to a dynasty that the man had hated. "Give me the heart," he said.
"Monsieur,"
protested the priest, attempting to step between them. "Father," Sebastian began, just as Lady Giselle gave the priest a violent shove that sent him staggering into Sebastian.
"Bloody hell,"
swore Sebastian, reaching out to steady the old man, as Giselle whirled and ran for the front of the chapel. She had the heavy skirts of her gown fisted in one hand, the urn clutched tight against her side. She'd almost reached the doors when she obviously remembered they were locked. She hesitated only an instant, then veered off, intent on circling back toward the sacristy. But Sebastian was already setting the bleating priest aside and moving to cut her off. For one intense moment her furious gaze met his. Then she turned and dashed up the narrow wooden stairs of the west gallery. He pelted after her, taking the steep steps two at a time. He erupted onto the creaky gallery to find her backed against the wooden balustrade, the urn raised like a weapon. "Don't come any closer to me," she said with awful calm. He drew up abruptly. "I won't hurt you. Just give me the heart." She shook her head. "You asked how I happen to know the identity of the cabinet-maker, Bullock. Well, I'll tell you. I made it my business to know. I realized he might prove a useful distraction if it looked as if you were becoming more than a nuisance, as you have. Which is why, before he came to meet me here, my cousin stopped by Tichborne Street to make certain Bullock knows about the child. He's very angry with you, you know. He's sworn he'll take his revenge against both you and Alexis Sauvage." "Damien Peloton's son is safe." Sebastian took a step closer, then another. "Bullock will never get to him." She gave a high, ringing laugh that echoed around the small chapel. The rain drummed on the roof and the gusting wind drove the torrent against the windows in waves. "I'm not talking about Noël Durand, you fool. What interest have I in a prince's bastard? I'm talking about your child. Your unborn child." Sebastian drew up abruptly, a cold prickling running across his scalp. "Bullock is going to kill it," she said with cold triumph. "The child and its mother, both." Sebastian took another step toward her. "I don't believe you." "Then that is the greatest revenge of all, is it not?" she said, and slammed the heavy urn against his head. The sharp edge of a silver handle sliced into his scalp, sending hot blood coursing down the side of his face. He put up an arm to fend her off, but she swung the urn at him again, her features distorted with rage and hatred and blind determination. He flung her off, the blood in his eyes now. She stumbled back, off balance, careening hard against the gallery's wooden balustrade. Sebastian heard the crack of breaking wood, saw the horror of comprehension flood her face. The old railing gave way, the banister shattering. She scrabbled one-handed to catch herself. If she'd let go of the urn, she might have saved herself. But she held on to it, falling backward into space with a cry of rage, her black skirts billowing around her. "Mon Dieu!" screamed the priest, as she slammed into the pavement with a bone-breaking smack. The impact knocked the urn from her grasp, the rock crystal shattering against the pavement in a shower of clear, glittering fragments, the torn heart coming to rest just inches from her outflung hand. She stared up at the chapel ceiling with wide, sightless eyes. But Sebastian didn't even pause to make certain she was dead. He was already running for the door. Chapter 57. Paul Gibson sat with his back propped against the edge of the kitchen table, a smile crinkling his eyes as he watched Alexei fill the tea kettle and set it on the trivet. "I didn't offer you a place to stay to turn you into some one-legged Irishman's cook and housekeeper." She looked up at him. The firelight gleamed through the glorious cascade of her hair in a way that made him think of misty sunrises and the first turning leaves of autumn. "Mrs. Federico will be back just as soon as she feels she's made her point." She straightened and came to stand between his spread thighs, her hands on his shoulders, her gaze locked with his as she mimicked his brogue. "And what's wrong with a one-legged Irishman, then, He rested his hands on her hips, still awed by the realization that she desired him, that she saw something of worth in him. He was desperately afraid she'd eventually realized he wasn't worthy of her, that she was driven more by a combination of gratitude and pity than by a recognition of deep affinity and the kind of loving respect that could endure. "Alexei," he began, only to break off at the sound of a knock on the front door. "Well, go on," she said, moving away with a laugh when he hesitated. He pushed regretfully to his feet. "That'll be Devlin, come for the results of the autopsy on that Haymarket jeweller." Snagging a brace of candles, he limped down the passage to open the front door. Only it wasn't Devlin. It was Lord Jarvis's tall, intimidating daughter, a footman at her side holding an umbrella. A fine rain had begun to fall, driven in stinging eddies by a growing wind. "Good God, Lady Devlin!" Gibson took a quick step back. "Come in, please. Is something wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," she said, giving her wet skirts a shake as she entered the narrow passage. She nodded to the footman, who closed the umbrella, and darted back toward the waiting carriage. "I'd like to speak to Alexei Sauvage. Is she here?" "I am." Gibson looked over his shoulder to find Alexei standing with her head held high, her arms folded tight against her waist. The two women's gazes met, clashed. "I won't keep you," said the Viscountess. "I've come to apologize for my rudeness. I accused you of the basest of motives when your sole intent was to try to save the life of my child. And for that, I am sorry." Alexei came up beside him, her lips parted in surprise. "It worked? The babe turned?" A strange smile played about the Viscountess's lips, and Gibson thought he'd never seen her look more approachable, or more likeable. "Yes. I don't know how to thank you, except to say, I'm sorry." She turned to leave, but Alexei put out a hand, stopping her. "I was just making tea. Please say you'll join us." The Viscountess shook her head. "I don't want to intrude." "At least stay till the storm eases up a bit," said Gibson as the rain pelted down harder. She hesitated, then gave a slow smile. "All right. Thank you." He led the way to the parlour, while Alexei disappeared into the kitchen. "When I heard your knock," he said, setting the candlestick on the chest near the door, "I thought it might be Devlin coming about Farragut's autopsy." She went to stand before the fire, her hands extended toward the blaze. "Did you discover anything?" "Just this, which I'll admit has nothing to do with the poor man's murder." He picked up one of the heavy, alcohol-filled specimen jars that lined the mantel. "It's a wee bit hard to see, I'll admit." "What is it? It looks like a—" She broke off, the colour draining from her face as she stared beyond him toward the doorway. Breathing in a sudden stench of wet wool and fresh wood shavings and rank male sweat, Gibson turned, feeling as if he were helplessly caught in a dream, spinning into an irrevocable nightmare. Samson Bullock filled the doorway,
his hat and shoulders dark with rain, his features twisted into a triumphant sneer. He held Alexei before him, a hank of her fiery hair wrapped around his meaty fist, the blade of a butcher knife laid flat against her cheek. Her face was alabaster white, her throat working violently as she fought to swallow. She was so small that the top of her head didn't even come up to the massive cabinet-maker's shoulder, and Gibson felt his heart thump against his ribs, heard a strange roaring in his ears. His gaze locked with Alexei's, and he took an unconscious step forward.
"What the bloody—" "Come any closer, and the lady doctor here loses an eye,"
warned Bullock, increasing the pressure on the flat of the blade until it pressed into Alexei's face, distorting her features, and drawing a trickle of blood high on her cheek. Gibson drew up, his hands gripping the specimen jar so hard they hurt. He was suddenly hideously aware of the rasp of his breath sucking in and out, the violent flickering of the candle flames eddied by a cold draught he realized must be coming from the open kitchen door. "Who are you?" demanded the Viscountess.
"Don't you know?"
The cabinet-maker gave a jeering laugh that held no real humour.
"You mean to say your husband, the high and mighty Viscount Devlin, didn't tell you about me?"
"His name is Samson Bullock," said Alexei, her voice awe-inspiringly calm, "and he's here because he holds me responsible for his brother's death." Bullock tightened his hold on her hair hard enough to make her wince as he pulled her head back at an unnatural angle.
"You are responsible, you bloody bitch. I've told you, I'll make you sorry you ever stuck that Frenchy nose of yours where it don't belong. You're sorry now, Thanks to you, your brother's dead, and that woman of yours too. Now it's your turn."
He slid the knife away from her cheek to point it at Hero Devlin.
"And hers."
Gibson took a slow, careful step forward, then another, the specimen jar still gripped in his hands. He was shaking so badly he nearly dropped it, his gait an awkward hobble.
"Damn you, I told you not to move," swore Bullock.
He nodded to the specimen in Gibson's hands.
"What the bloody hell is that?"
"This." Gibson held up the jar. "It's a heart." His gaze locked with Alexei's. He tried desperately to convey to her what he intended to do, even as he acknowledged that it was impossible. He hoped that at least she understood to expect something. He eased the cork from the jar's wide top. "It's quite oddly shaped. Want to see?" he asked, and dashed the contents in the cabinet-maker's face. Bullock roared and reared back as the alcohol stung his eyes. He held onto the knife, but let go of Alexei to swipe his big hand across his face. Ducking beneath his arm, she snatched up the brace of candles from the nearby chest and thrust their flames against his coat. The alcohol-soaked cloth caught with a whoosh, the flames leaping up to light his long black hair. "Alexei!" screamed Gibson, terrified the flames would ignite the alcohol that had inevitably also splashed over her head and shoulders. Bullock let out another bellow, turning blindly this way and that, sending his battered hat flying as he beat at his head and tried to tear off his flaming coat.
"I'll kill you!" he screamed. "I'll kill you all!"
Devlin's wife whirled toward the fireplace. It wasn't until she seized the poker with both hands that Gibson realized what she was about. Throwing all her weight behind it, she took a step forward and swung the poker at the cabinet-maker's head. The solid iron bar smashed into the side of Bullock's skull with an ugly, bone-crunching thwunk. He went down hard, knocking over the end table as he fell, the flames leaping from his coat and hair to catch the tattered, alcohol-soaked carpet. "Quick!" shouted Gibson, stumbling and almost falling as he lurched toward the windows. "The drapes!" Alexei got there first, yanking down the worn heavy cloth in a cloud of dust and cobwebs. Hero Devlin tore off her cape, smoke billowing as she beat at the flames that were already crackling toward the door. "Here!" shouted Alexei, flinging the drapes at the fire. Together they beat and stomped until the last of the flames had died, and the cabinet-maker lay in the midst of a black, charred carpet, his head a pulpy mess. "I trust he's dead," said the Viscountess.
"Yes," said Alexei. Their breath coming hard and fast, their faces flushed with heat and triumph, the three exchanged exultant glances that required no words to clarify their meaning. Then a distant shout and the crash of the front door brought them around. Devlin catapulted into the parlour, only to draw up short, his gaze jerking from his wife to Gibson and Alexei, to the bloody blackened corpse at their feet. "What the hell?" The Viscountess wore a strange, stunned expression that puzzled Gibson until he noticed the wet stain that soaked her skirts and spread across the carpet at her feet, a stain that had nothing to do with the alcohol he had thrown. "Well," said Gibson, with a laugh driven by giddy relief, "you may be a wee bit late to help take care of Mr. Bullock here, but at least you're in time to escort your wife home. Quickly, I should think. From the looks of things, your babe has decided that now is a grand time to be putting in its appearance."
Chapter 58. Saturday, 30th of January. The babe might have turned, but Hero laboured hard all that night and half of the next day. At first Sebastian helped her walk back and forth before the fire as the storm outside whipped wild gusts of wind and driven rain against the house. Then, when the pains came so hard and fast she could no longer walk, he sat beside her, her hand held fast in his. If he could have taken her pain into his own body, he would have done so. After a few more hours, he thought that if he could give his life to stop this endless, inhuman agony, he'd do that too. And still the babe refused to come. "Mother of God, why don't you do something?" he raged once at Alexei Sauvage sometime around mid-afternoon. Gibson had insisted on deferring to the French doctor, saying she'd delivered more babies in the past year alone than he had in his entire career. But as the hours dragged on, and Hero laboured in grim-faced, silent endurance, Sebastian had to doubt his friend's wisdom. The Frenchwoman looked at him, her own face flushed and etched with lines of exhaustion. "Your son will come when he is ready, my lord." "First babies do have a habit of taking their own sweet time," said Gibson softly. "How much time?" Sebastian wanted to scream. But somehow he swallowed it, and plastered a facade of calm over a cold, soul-destroying terror. Occasionally he could hear the voices of Hendon, Jarvis, and Lady Jarvis waiting together in a tense vigil downstairs. Claire Bissett kept bringing food that Gibson and Alexei both ate with a hearty appetite that Sebastian found revolting. And then, just when Sebastian thought Hero could surely endure no more, Alexei said, "It's coming." He couldn't look, and so he looked instead at Hero's face. And he knew that any man who'd ever arrogantly boasted of the male sex's superior strength, endurance, and courage had never watched a woman give birth. "You did it, my lady," said Alexei, her voice thick with a rare emotion. Hero clutched Sebastian's arm, her fingers digging deep into his flesh, her entire body shaking and heaving with exhaustion and triumph. "Is it all right? Please tell me it's all right." She was answered by a lusty squall that brought a sting of tears to Sebastian's eyes, so that he had to bury his face in the sweat-soaked tangle of Hero's hair. "You've a fine son," said Alexei, holding up a kicking, screaming infant smeared with a hellish mixture of blood and something white and waxy. Hero gave a tired, shaky laugh, her arms opening wide to receive her son. She lay smiling down at the screaming infant for the longest time, an expression Sebastian had never seen before softening her features. Then she looked up, her gaze meeting his, and he fell in love with her all over again. "Told you it was a boy," she whispered. "The next one couldn't be your girl." Just the thought of putting her through this again made his legs suddenly weak, and he found he had to sit.
"Have you decided on a name?" asked Alexei.
"Simon," said Hero. After months of wrangling, they'd finally reached a compromise. She could name the boys, while he would name the girls. "Simon, Alistair, Sincere." She shifted the babe to face Sebastian so that he got his first really good look at his son. He had a head of thick dark hair plastered to his skull, but his eyes were screwed shut, his face contorted and flushed red with his howls.
"What colour are his eyes?" asked Gibson.
"I don't know," said Hero. "He's screaming so hard, I can't see." And then, as if aware of the intense scrutiny directed upon him, Simon Sincere drew in a shuddering breath, ceased his cries, and opened his eyes.
"The Lord above preserve us," said Gibson.
They were yellow. Tuesday, 2nd of February. The day dawned grey and blustery, the clouds heavy with the threat of more rain. Paul Gibson stood beside the grave of Damien Pelleton. A small hole had been dug down through the grave's soft, recently filled earth. Alexei stood at his side, a small wooden box containing her brother's heart held in her hands. The wind whipped the hair around her head and flapped the black skirts of her morning gown. Her face was pale but composed, her head held high. He wondered if she was praying, and realized he didn't even know this about her, if she believed in a god, or sought solace in her religion. He'd asked her last night, as they lay in each other's arms, if she was truly certain that Damien Pelleton was her father's son, and not the lost dauphin of the temple. She'd looked at him quietly for a moment. Then her gaze shifted to some place far, far away. She shook her head, her breath catching, and said, "No." He supposed they'd never know the truth. Perhaps some questions were never meant to be answered. He wondered if anyone would ever know or even care how many millions had lost their lives in this endless war that raged from one end of Europe to the other. Some died filled with that oddly altruistic hubris known as patriotism. Some died for glory, or God, or money to buy ale and whores. Others for a dimly understood or misunderstood principle. But most died simply because they were in the wrong place, or because they were doing what they were told. He figured arrogant men of overweening ambition and insatiable greed would always manage to convince or coerce others into dying for them. He watched Alexei nestle the small wooden box containing Damien Pelleton's heart deep into the space that had been dug for it, then take a handful of dirt from the pile beside it, and release it in a rush of falling earth. Gibson nodded to the sexton, who began to fill the hole with heavy shovelfuls that quickly hid the box from their sight. The heart of an uncrowned king, or a simple physician's son? Did it matter which they buried, Gibson wondered. He thought not, although he knew that for questions such as this wars were fought, and men died, and other men, such as he, limped through life on mangled limbs. They stood together, side by side, until the last of the earth lay heaped upon the grave, and the sexton walked away. And still they stood, her hand creeping out to take his. Their gazes meeting as the wind snatched at her hair, and her lips curved into a trembling smile.
The End. You've been listening to Why Kings Confess, a Sebastian Sincere mystery, by C.S. Harris, narrated by Davina Porter, and directed by Erica Jensen. If you've enjoyed this book and this performance, Recorded Books recommends The Somnambulist, by Jonathan Barnes, narrated by John Curlis. Once the toast of good society in victorious England, Edward Moon no longer commands the respect or inspires the awe that he did in earlier times. Despite having previously unravelled more than 60 perplexing criminal puzzles, to the delight of London's constabulary, these days he's considered something of an embarrassment. Frightening and darkly hilarious, the somnambulist stirs more than a pinch of outrageousness into its demonically delicious brew. Recorded Books offers a wide selection of bestsellers, mysteries, classics, histories, and more. So look for us at your public library, or on download sites online. And thank you for being a Recorded Books reader.